The Unheard, a story of silence, justice, and the voice they never saw coming. To dismantle everything. If you've ever to dismantle everything. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told your voice doesn't matter in rooms that were never built for you, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because this one doesn't end the way they planned. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button before we're done. This is Nia Carter's story, The Woman in the Apron. The laughter started before she even reached the railing. It moved through the gallery in waves. First a snicker from the back row near the doors, then a ripple of disbelieving chuckles that spread across the polished mahogany benches until it reached the front, where the plaintiff's legal team sat in their tailored suits and practiced expressions of barely contained contempt. One of them, a junior associate with slicked hair and a Rolex that caught the morning light, actually raised his phone and started filming. Nia Carter didn't stop walking. She was 28 years old. She stood 5'4" in the flat-soled shoes she wore on the job, and she was still wearing the uniform from that job, dark slacks, a pale blue blouse, and a housekeeper's apron with the embroidered crest of the Meridian Grand Hotel stitched above the left breast pocket. She had worked the early shift. She had not had time to go home and change, and even if she had, she wasn't sure she would have. There was something in her that morning that did not want to pretend to be something she wasn't. Not in this room, not today. "Order," said Judge Patricia Wren, and the laughter didn't exactly die. It softened into the kind of restrained amusement that well-dressed people produce when they want to appear dignified while still enjoying a joke. Judge Wren was 61, with silver-streaked hair pulled tight, and eyes that had seen enough courtroom theater to recognize the difference between disruption and surprise. She watched Nia approach with an expression that was not unkind, but was undeniably measured. "Ma'am, this is a federal proceeding. I'm going to need you to identify yourself and state your business before I have you removed." "Nia Carter," Nia said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm here to represent the defendant." The laughter came back, louder this time. At the defense table, Grant Whitmore turned in his chair. He was 54, broad-shouldered in the way that wealthy men of a certain generation often were, with silver hair swept back from a face that belonged on the cover of a financial magazine. 3 weeks ago, it had been. Forbes. The headline had read, "Whitmore at the top, and how he plans to stay there." Today, in this courtroom, without his attorney, he looked like a man standing on ice that was beginning to crack. His eyes moved from Nia to Judge Wren and back, calibrating, assessing. The same instincts that had built him 3 companies and a net worth north of $4 billion, now working to determine whether this woman in a hotel apron was an opportunity or a complication. He had not decided yet. "Miss Carter." Judge Wren removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench with deliberate care. "Are you a member of the New York Bar?" "I am not currently active," Nia said, "but I have completed my legal education, and under federal pro-HS vice frameworks and the court's supervisory discretion, I am asking for temporary permission to assist Mr. Whitmore in these proceedings, given the documented absence of his retained counsel." That stopped the laughter entirely. The room had a different quality now. Not silence exactly, but a held breath. Even the junior associate with the Rolex lowered his phone slightly. The absence of Marcus Tilden, Esquire, senior partner at Tilden Greer Associates, the man who had been paid $3 million to defend Grant Whitmore against the most serious fraud charges brought in the Southern District in a decade, was, at this point, the second most remarkable thing to happen in this courtroom that morning. Tilden had simply not arrived. His office had reached his personal cell, his driver, his hotel room, and his emergency contact, in that order, and gotten nothing. Not silence, not deflection, nothing. The man was, as of 47 minutes ago, officially and inexplicably missing. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Wren looked at the defendant directly. "You have the right to counsel of your choosing. Do you wish to accept Miss Carter's offer of assistance under the court's supervision, or would you prefer a continuance to retain new representation?" Grant Whitmore looked at Nia Carter for a long moment. She met his gaze without flinching. She had learned, working in the rooms of powerful people for 6 years, making their beds, restocking their minibars, watching them conduct conference calls in robes. that the way you stood before them mattered as much as anything you said. She stood the way she always stood, straight, still, not performing anything. She stays, he said. The case against Grant Whitmore had been constructed with the precision of a surgical strike. The plaintiff was Aldrich Capital Partners, a mid-sized private equity firm based in Geneva, with satellite offices in New York and Singapore. Their claim, filed 8 months ago in what had seemed like a routine commercial dispute, alleged that Whitmore had fraudulently altered the terms of a 2019 merger agreement, a document that had transferred a significant stake in a biotech startup called Heliogen to Aldrich in exchange for a capital injection of $230 million. The altered terms, according to Aldrich's complaint, gave Whitmore an escape clause that had not existed in the original agreement, allowing him to exit the deal without penalty when Heliogen's valuation surged following a breakthrough patent in 2022. The escape clause had saved Whitmore approximately $90 million. According to Aldrich, he had forged it. It was, on its surface, a compelling case. There were two versions of the contract, one held by Aldrich, one held by Whitmore's team, and they differed in a way that was too specific, too material, to be accidental. Forensic document examiners hired by Aldrich had testified in the preliminary hearings that metadata embedded in the electronic version of the contract indicated late-stage editing inconsistent with the original execution date. An expert witness, a retired federal prosecutor named Dr. Alan Marsh, had given a presentation to the court that was, by most accounts, devastating. Whitmore had maintained his innocence through all of it. His attorneys had challenged the forensics on technical grounds and lost. His reputation, once polished to a high shine, had been quietly but systematically dismantled in the financial press over the preceding 8 months. There were institutional investors who had already begun distancing themselves from his current mud. There were board members who had stepped back. There were people who had been photographed at his charity events who no longer returned his calls. And now Marcus Tilden was gone, and a housekeeper was standing in his place. The lead attorney for Aldrich Capital was a man named Douglas Fain. He was 57, a former U.S. attorney from the Eastern District, and he had the polished aggression of someone who had spent 3 decades winning rooms. He looked at Nia across the courtroom with the expression a chess grandmaster might use when told his opponent has been replaced by a child. "Your Honor," he said, rising smoothly from his chair, "the plaintiff has significant concerns about the orderly administration of these proceedings if the court permits an unlicensed individual to participate in a federal fraud case of this complexity." "Noted," said Judge Wren. "I share some of those concerns, Mr. Fain. However, the defendant has a right to assistance, and the court has the discretion to allow supervised participation under appropriate limitations. Ms. Carter will operate under those limitations." She looked at Nia. "Any examination of witnesses, any submission of evidence, any formal argument will require my prior approval. You will not make legal claims you are not prepared to support. You will not introduce materials not properly authenticated. Do you understand those conditions?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Then we'll proceed." Judge Wren replaced her glasses. "Mr. Fain, I believe you were about to resume your examination of the plaintiff's second witness." Douglas Fain sat down slowly, in the way that powerful men sometimes sit when they are reclassifying a situation without wanting anyone to notice, Chachet. Nia had 7 minutes to confer with Grant Whitmore before Fain resumed. She sat beside him at the defense table and opened the legal pad she had been carrying. It was covered in tight, even handwriting, notes she had made over the past 3 days since the moment she had read about the case in the Post, and something in her had simply refused to leave it alone. "You need to know something," she said quietly. "I'm not your lawyer. I'm not going to pretend to be. But I've been studying this case for 72 hours, and I think there's something wrong with their forensic claim." Grant looked at her. Up close, without the Forbes cover composure, he looked tired. Not defeated, she didn't read defeat in him, but worn in the way that prolonged, grinding uncertainty made people worn. "You studied a fraud case in 72 hours. I've been studying law for 12 years, she said, without bitterness, without performance, just stating it the way she stated facts. "I had to stop before I finished. I never stopped reading." He held her gaze. "What did you find?" Their expert says the metadata shows the escape clause was inserted after the original execution date. But the SEC filing for the Heliogen deal, which is a public record, references the same clause language in a disclosure footnote filed 6 months before Aldrich says the forgery happened. She turned her legal pad to show him a column of dates. If your version of the contract was forged after execution, the SEC filing containing that clause language would have had to be forged too. And the SEC doesn't have two versions. They have one. Grant Whitmore stared at the column of dates. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not just relief, but the specific, visceral relief of a man who has been told that the thing he knew to be true can be proven. How did no one catch that? He said. I don't know yet, she said. But that's what I'm going to find out. Chat. Raymond Cho was the plaintiff's second witness, a forensic digital analyst hired by Aldrich Capital, who had spent 11 years working for the FBI's cyber division before entering private practice. He was thorough, credentialed, and composed. He had testified in 16 federal cases and had never been successfully challenged on his core methodology. Douglas Fain walked him through his conclusions with the ease of someone who had rehearsed the choreography many times. The metadata, the editing timestamps, the software version inconsistencies, the pattern of linguistic revision that, according to Cho, suggested document manipulation consistent with after-the-fact insertion of contractual language. It was, Nia had to admit, impressive. Cho was good. His presentation was clean and his vocabulary was precise, and he had the bearing of someone who did not expect to be troubled by follow-up questions. Ms. Carter, said Judge Wren, do you wish to cross-examine? Yes, Your Honor. She stood. She moved to the podium. She set her legal pad down and looked at Raymond Cho with the calm she had learned to manufacture in hotel corridors. In situations where guests spoke to her as though she were furniture, and she had to smile and find the still place inside herself. Mr. Cho, she said, you testified that the metadata embedded in Mr. Whitmore's version of the contract shows editing activity inconsistent with the contract's execution date. That's correct. And that editing activity, in your professional opinion, indicates that clauses were added to the document after it was originally signed. Yes. Mr. Cho, are you familiar with the SEC filing associated with the Heliogen acquisition? Specifically, Form 8K filed by Whitmore Capital Partners on March 14, 2019? A fractional pause, barely perceptible. I'm familiar with the filing in general terms. In general terms, Nia picked up a document from her pad, a printed copy she had obtained from the SEC's public Edgar database at 11:30 the previous night, in the kitchen of her apartment on East 117th Street, while her daughter slept in the next room. This is the 8K filing from March 14, 2019. I'd like to direct your attention to footnote 7 on page 12, which reads, she looked at Judge Wren. With the court's permission? Proceed. She read the footnote. It was dry language, the kind of language that appeared in hundreds of regulatory filings every year, the kind of language that competent people learn to scan past because it rarely contained surprises. But this footnote contained, embedded in its careful legalese, a direct reference to the exit provision. The same exit provision that Aldrich Capital claimed had been fraudulently inserted into the contract months after this filing was made. The room didn't exactly react. It was too sophisticated a room for that. But she felt the quality of attention change. Mr. Cho, she said, if the clause at issue was inserted into Mr. Whitmore's contract after the execution date, as you've testified, how do you explain the presence of the same clause language in this SEC filing, which is dated 6 months before your proposed window of forgery? Raymond Cho looked at Douglas Fain. It was a brief look, the kind that lawyers and their expert witnesses were not supposed to exchange in front of a judge, and Judge Wren noticed it because Judge Wren noticed everything. I would need to review that specific document, Cho said. Of course, said Nia. I'd like to enter this as a defense exhibit, Your Honor. Any objection? Said Judge Wren. Douglas Fain stood. We'd like the opportunity to authenticate the document. The document is a public SEC filing, Nia said. It's available at this moment on the Edgar database. Anyone with a phone can pull it. Judge Wren looked at Fain for a moment. I'll allow it. We'll take a 20-minute recess. Mr. Cho, please review the exhibit. The 20-minute recess lasted 40 minutes. Nia sat in the hallway on a wooden bench outside courtroom 4B and ate the granola bar she'd had in her bag since 6 that morning. She checked her phone. There was a message from her daughter's school. Maya had a field trip permission slip that needed to be returned by Friday. There was a message from her supervisor at the Meridian asking when she'd be back from her appointment. There was nothing from Marcus Tilden's office, or from anyone connected to this case. She thought about that. Tilden's disappearance was not, she suspected, an accident. It was too perfectly timed. First day of testimony, after months of preparation, after the defendant had paid an enormous retainer. Attorneys didn't simply vanish. Not like this. Not without at least a call to a paralegal, a note on a calendar, some kind of trace. The absence of a trace was itself a trace, and it pointed somewhere she hadn't had time to look yet. But that was for later. Right now, she had Raymond Cho on the stand, and she needed to understand what he would say when court resumed. What he said when court resumed was measured and careful, and precisely the kind of answer that someone gives when they are trying to limit damage without committing to a position. He acknowledged that the footnote language in the SEC filing bore similarities to the clause at issue. He noted that SEC filings were sometimes prepared in advance of finalized contract language. He suggested that the contract and the filing might have been drafted concurrently by separate teams working from shared preliminary documents, which could produce linguistic overlap without indicating the contract's authenticity. It was a reasonable answer. It was the kind of answer that a thorough expert witness, under pressure, could produce in 40 minutes. But it was different from what he had said before, and Judge Wren wrote something down when he said it. Grant Whitmore found her in the hallway during the lunch recess. He was alone. His team of associates had learned quickly that when he walked with a certain deliberate pace, you gave him space. He sat down on the bench beside her without asking if the seat was taken. "That was impressive," he said. "It was a start," she said. "They'll recover from it." "Probably." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to know why you're here." She considered several answers and settled on the true one. "Well, because I read about this case and the math didn't work. And when math doesn't work, it's because someone made it not work." "You don't know me." "No." "You don't know if I'm guilty." She looked at him. "Do you know what I do every day? I clean rooms. I change sheets that cost more than my monthly rent. I watch people with your kind of money, conduct their lives. And I listen to how they talk on the phone, and I watch how they treat the people who bring them things. And I've learned something." She folded her hands in her lap. "Guilty people talk differently than people who've been set up, not because of what they say, because of what they don't say." She paused. "You haven't once told me you're innocent. You haven't asked me to believe you. You haven't tried to manage my impression of you. Every time I show you evidence, you just look at it and ask what I'm going to do next." Grant Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. "My daughter is 6, he said. "Her name is Charlotte. She thinks I'm some kind of superhero." Nia nodded slowly. "Maya is 8. She thinks I know how to fix anything." They sat in the hallway of the federal courthouse, two people from entirely different worlds, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable. That evening, Nia spread the case files across her kitchen table and started over. She had been working the SEC angle. That was the public record, the cleanest line, the thing she'd been able to bring into court. But the SEC angle was a defense against their forensic claim. It wasn't the thing she actually needed to understand. What she actually needed to understand was the contract itself. She pulled up the metadata report that Cho's team had produced in the pretrial proceedings. She had obtained it through the court's public filing system 2 days ago and had been reading it in segments, on her phone, during the subway commute, and on her lunch break. Now, with the full document spread in front of her and a cup of coffee going cold beside her elbow, she began reading it the way she had been trained to read evidentiary documents, not for conclusions, but for the language used to reach them. The conclusion said the contract had been altered, but the language, the specific technical language of the metadata analysis, was interesting. Not wrong, necessarily, but specific in a way that felt to her ear slightly off. She had read enough SEC filings, enough merger agreements, enough transactional documents produced by American corporate law firms to have developed a sense of what that language sounded like. The Whitmore contracts she had found in the public record, there were 3 others from deals made in 2016, 2017, and 2018, had a consistent syntactic fingerprint, short declarative clauses, specific indemnification phrasing, a particular approach to dispute resolution language that favored domestic arbitration. The escape clause in the disputed contract didn't quite sound like those. It sounded, she thought, like a translation. Not a bad one, not an obvious one, but the kind that someone who had grown up reading American legal documents would notice, the way a native speaker notices when grammar is technically correct but rhythmically foreign. She wrote, "offshore language insertion," and underlined it twice. Her phone buzzed at 11:47. Unknown number. She answered it because she had been expecting something like this. The voice was male, modulated low, deliberately unhurried. "Ms. Carter," it said. "You're a smart woman, smart enough to know when something isn't worth the risk." She said nothing. "You have a daughter," the voice continued. "You have a job. You have a life that is small and functional and safe. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no reason for it to become complicated." "Who is this?" she said. The line went dead. She sat at her kitchen table for a moment, holding the phone. Then she looked at the contract document spread in front of her and at the 2 words she had written and underlined. Then she went to her daughter's room and stood in the doorway for a while, watching Maya sleep. Then she went back to the kitchen table and kept working. She found the first significant crack 3 days later, and it came not from the contract itself, but from a name. She had been building a timeline, a document she was constructing in parallel columns, one tracking the Heliogen deal chronology as established in the public record, the other tracking the forensic claims in Cho's metadata report. She was looking for the places where the columns failed to align. One of those places was a name. The metadata report referenced, in a technical footnote about the document's editing trail, a user credential, the kind of identifier that document management software assigned to individual accounts. The credential was a string of letters and numbers, deliberately anonymized in the report, but the footnote explained that it corresponded to an account associated with the defendant's document management service. What the footnote did not explain was why that account, if it had been used to alter the contract after execution, appeared in the system logs before Whitmore's company had contracted with that document management service. Nia had obtained the service contract for the document management company through a public business filing, cross-referenced with a vendor disclosure in one of Whitmore Capital's annual investor letters. The service agreement was dated October 2019. The metadata editing log showed activity in the account as early as July 2019, 3 months before the service even existed. She sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Someone had been sloppy. Not catastrophically sloppy. Careful people, looking carefully, under pressure, with limited time, would miss this. But she had been looking for precisely this kind of chronological fracture, and she had found one. The question now was, who had access to that service account before the service officially existed? And that question led her to a name she hadn't seen before, a name that appeared in the service company's own public incorporation documents, listed as a founding technical consultant. The name was Thomas Vail. She searched Thomas Vail for 40 minutes and found, among other things, that he had previously worked as an administrative assistant for Aldrich Capital Partners between 2018 and early 2020, before departing the company under circumstances that were not publicly specified. She wrote his name at the top of a fresh page and drew a circle around it. She told Grant the next morning, in the 15 minutes before court resumed. He listened without interrupting. She had noticed that about him, that quality of attention, the way he listened to information, the way a person listened to music they were trying to memorize. "Vail," he said when she finished. "He worked for Aldrich until 2020, then disappeared from public record. I can't find a current address, but he's connected to the document service through the incorporation filing, and that service account shouldn't have existed when the alleged editing occurred. Can you prove the account predates the service contract? I have the service contract dated October 2019 and editing logs showing account activity in July 2019. Both are documents of record. The question is whether anyone will look at them together. Grant was quiet. Then, my former attorney, Tilden, had a paralegal named Dev. She worked every document in this case. She's the one who flagged some of the metadata issues to me before the case even went to preliminary hearings. She was nervous, more than nervous. He paused. She stopped returning my calls 2 weeks before Tilden disappeared. Nia wrote down, Dev, paralegal, Tilden, firm. Her full name? Devorah Rice. Dev was what everyone called her. He looked at Nia. She found something she wasn't supposed to find, and now she and her boss are both gone. Nia held his gaze. Then we need to find what she found. But the answer came from a place she hadn't expected. She had been searching, carefully, methodically, through the public edges of everything she could access for any trace of Thomas Vale after his departure from Aldrich. Corporate filings, professional licenses, conference registrations, anything that left a footprint in a searchable database. What she found, finally, was a reference in an archived professional directory from 2021, listing Thomas Vale as a technical consultant for a private document services company registered in Delaware, operating under a name that translated roughly from its German original as Meridian Archive Solutions. The word Meridian stopped her. She worked at the Meridian Grand Hotel. The coincidence was almost certainly nothing, but she had learned to treat coincidences as addresses, starting points, not conclusions. She searched Meridian Archive Solutions and found, in a business court filing from 2022, an unrelated contract dispute, a reference to a storage locker contract held by the company at a facility in the meatpacking district. She found the facility's contact number. She called, and in the smooth, professional voice she used when she needed to sound like someone who belonged in rooms she hadn't been invited to, asked about a storage account associated with Meridian Archive Solutions. The person on the other end was helpful in the way that people who work at storage facilities were helpful. Not very, but enough. They couldn't share account information, but they could confirm the account was active. She wrote down the facility's address. Then she looked at the notes she'd made, the metadata anomalies, the chronological fractures, the contract language that sounded translated, the name Thomas Vale, the missing paralegal, the threatening phone call, and she laid them out in front of her like cards on a table. And she saw, for the first time, the shape of the thing she was dealing with. This wasn't a fraud case that had gone complicated. This was a fraud case that had been designed to look like Grant Whitmore's fraud, while actually being something else entirely. A mechanism, carefully constructed, to take something from him, to force a result that he would never have agreed to in a clean transaction. She didn't have all the pieces. Not yet, but she knew where some of them were. She went to the storage facility on a Wednesday evening after her shift at the hotel, still in her work shoes. She had called ahead and confirmed the unit number, not the specific locker, but a general section, using a method she was not entirely sure was legal, and decided she could examine her conscience about later. The facility was clean and climate-controlled, the kind of place where people stored things they couldn't discard but didn't want to see. She walked the corridor slowly, reading unit numbers, until she found the section associated with the Meridian Archive Solutions account. The unit was locked with a combination padlock. She thought about the note she had found in the paralegal's cross-referenced notes, the planner entry that one of Grant's early attorneys had mentioned briefly, in a pre-trial memorandum that she had found buried in the court's public filings, a reference to a Zurich packet and a 4-digit code. She had found the 4 digits in the same memorandum, cited as an unexplained reference. She had written them down because she wrote down everything that didn't make immediate sense. She stood in front of the padlock for a moment. Then she entered the 4 digits. The lock opened. Inside the unit, among filing boxes and wrapped furniture, was a metal shelf containing a single sealed envelope, and beneath it a flash drive in a small plastic case. She stood there for a long moment, looking at them. Then she took them both, re-locked the unit, and walked back to the subway. She read the envelope's contents at her kitchen table, with Maya asleep and the apartment quiet. The memo was 11 pages. It was written in the kind of language that people used when they were being careful. Corporate language, the vocabulary of strategy sessions and risk assessments, the grammar of decisions that were made in expensive rooms by people who expected never to be accountable for them. But the content was not careful at all. What the memo described, in the dry, bloodless vocabulary of acquisition strategy, was a plan, a specific, sequenced plan to manufacture grounds for a legal dispute against Grant Whitmore, use that dispute to damage his relationships with institutional investors, create sufficient financial pressure to force him into a distressed position, and then acquire his controlling stake in Heliogen at a fraction of its actual value. The escape clause in the merger agreement hadn't been forged by Whitmore. It had been inserted remotely into a duplicate version of the contract, a version created using the Meridian Archive Solutions document service, accessed through a credential established before the service officially launched, by someone with administrative access to both the original contract's digital record and the litigation strategy outlined in this memo. The litigation, according to the memo's budget appendix, was listed as a line item under the heading Litigation Leverage. She read that phrase 3 times. Then she plugged in the USB drive and started examining its contents. She worked until 4 in the morning. When she finally stopped, she had a folder of documents on her laptop. Metadata logs, email chains, routing records, financial transfer authorizations that, taken together, formed a complete and internally consistent account of what had been done, how it had been done, and who had authorized it. She closed her laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Grant Whitmore's personal number, which he had given her on the second day, after the SEC filing cross-examination, when something in his assessment of her had quietly reclassified. He answered on the second ring. She could tell from the quality of silence on his end that he hadn't been sleeping either. "I found it," she said. He said nothing for a moment, then, "All of it?" "Enough," she said. "Enough to change everything." Back when she had imagined a different version of this life. One where she argued in courtrooms not as a visitor, not as a novelty, not as someone the gallery filmed on their phones, but as someone who belonged. She dreamed about that version, briefly, and when she woke in the gray early morning to the sound of Maya getting herself a glass of water, she sat up and looked at the files spread across the table and thought, maybe that version isn't so different from this one. Maya padded into the kitchen in her socks and looked at the papers and at her mother, and then she climbed into the chair beside Nia and leaned her head against her shoulder without saying anything, the way 8-year-olds sometimes did when they understood more than they had words for. "You okay, Mama?" "Yes, baby," Nia said. "I'm okay." She put her arm around her daughter. Outside the window, the city was just beginning to go light. She had a lot of work still ahead of her, but she had the shape of the truth now. And the truth, in her experience, was a thing that once you held it, you couldn't easily be made to let go. She held it. The morning after she found the envelope, Nia showered, dressed Maya for school, made oatmeal with brown sugar the way Maya liked it, walked her daughter to the corner of 117 in Lexington, and watched her disappear through the doors of PS 83 before allowing herself to feel the full weight of what was sitting in a folder on her laptop. Then she went to a copy shop on 3rd Avenue and made 3 complete copies of everything. The memo, the USB contents printed to paper, the metadata logs, the routing records, the budget appendix with its 2 cold words, litigation leverage. She put 1 copy in a padded envelope addressed to her sister in Philadelphia, another in a waterproof bag she sealed with tape and placed inside a hollowed-out textbook on the top shelf of her closet, and the 3rd she kept with her, in the canvas tote she carried to court. She was not being paranoid, she was being precise. There was a difference, and she had learned it the hard way, in the months after she had to leave law school, when she had watched carefully built things come apart, because someone had failed to account for the possibility that the world might not be friendly to what they were building. She arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes early and found Grant already there, seated at the defense table in a dark charcoal suit, coffee in hand, looking like a man who had also not slept much. He looked up when she came through the doors. She set her tote on the table, pulled out her legal pad, and sat. "I want to walk through everything you have," he said. "We have limited time before Fawn starts again," she said. "So I'm going to tell you the structure first, and then we'll go piece by piece." She opened her pad to the page where she had organized her summary the night before. Clean, numbered, sequential. What's in that envelope and on that drive is a memo authored by someone inside Aldrich Capital, detailing a plan to manufacture legal grounds against you, use the litigation to pressure your investors, and acquire your Heliogen position at a distressed price. It includes a budget line explicitly calling the lawsuit litigation leverage. It includes routing records for a VPN-based signature trail used to create and insert the fraudulent escape clause into a duplicate of the merger agreement. And it includes what appear to be internal authorization emails connecting the strategy to senior decision-makers at Aldrich. Grant set his coffee cup down very slowly. You're describing a conspiracy to commit securities fraud and document tampering and potentially witness interference depending on where Tilden and Devora Rice are and why they're gone. She met his eyes. I can't authenticate all of this myself. I need forensic verification for the digital records, and I need to do this through channels the court will accept. But the structure is there. The internal logic holds. Who knows you have this? No one, yet. You're the first person I've told. He studied her for a moment. You walked into a storage unit and took documents that may belong to someone else. The unit was accessible with a code referenced in court documents. The contents appear to be evidence in an active federal case. She kept her voice level. I'm aware of the chain of custody implications. That's why I need to move carefully. How carefully? Carefully enough that when I put this in front of Judge Wren, she can't set it aside on procedural grounds. She paused. I need a forensic technologist, someone credentialed and court-recognized, to verify the digital metadata. And I need a journalist. Grant raised an eyebrow. A journalist. Someone to hold the information independently, so that if anything happens to me or to these files, the story doesn't die with the evidence. She said it flatly, without drama, the way she said most things. I've already made copies, but copies can be found and destroyed. A journalist working the story creates a second layer that's much harder to eliminate. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I know someone. Marcus Tilden used to work with a reporter named Carla Osei. She's at the Tribune, covers financial crime. He said she was the only journalist he'd ever trusted with something sensitive. Nia wrote the name down. Can you get me a contact for her? I can try. He pulled out his phone. The other thing. The forensic technologist. My company uses a digital forensics firm for cybersecurity audits. The lead analyst there, a man named Paul Reyes, has testified in federal proceedings before. Give me his contact as well. Grant was already typing. You're moving fast. They've had 8 months to build this case, she said. I've had 4 days. Fast is the only speed I have. Douglas Fain entered the courtroom at that moment, flanked by 2 associates, carrying himself with the easy authority of someone who had not yet registered that the ground beneath him had shifted slightly overnight. He glanced at Nia as he passed, and something in the glance was professional and dismissive and just barely curious, the way a surgeon might glance at someone reading a medical textbook in a waiting room. She looked back at him with the expression she had learned to maintain when guests at the Meridian spoke to her, as though she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be addressed. Neutral, present, absorbing everything. Fain turned away first. Whooped it. The morning session continued with the plaintiff's third witness, a contract law expert from Columbia named Dr. Sandra Holt, who had published extensively on merger agreement standards and had been brought in to contextualize the escape clause as anomalous relative to industry practice. Holt was precise and academically credible and had clearly prepared for this testimony over many weeks. She walked through the standard structure of merger exit provisions. The typical language used in deals of comparable size and complexity, and the ways in which the disputed clause deviated from those norms. Under Fain's examination, she was methodical and persuasive. Nia listened to all of it without interrupting. She took notes in her precise handwriting, not reactive notes, but structural ones, mapping Holt's claims against what she now knew from the memo. There was something almost strange about sitting in this courtroom in her housekeeper's uniform because she'd had an early morning shift before court and hadn't had time to change, listening to an expert explain why a fraudulent escape clause was anomalous, while she was holding in her bag the document that explained who had actually written it and why. She waited. When Fain concluded his examination and Judge Wren turned to her, she stood. Dr. Holt, she began, you testified that the exit provision in the disputed contract is anomalous relative to industry standard. What's your basis for that characterization? My basis is a review of comparable merger agreements in the biotech and private equity sectors over the past decade, Holt said. The provision in question uses structural language that's more commonly found in European-style arbitration exit frameworks than in domestic U.S. merger agreements. Nia held that for just a beat. European style, she said. Yes. Specifically, the syntactic structure of the indemnification carve-out within the exit provision is more consistent with frameworks used in Swiss and German transactional law than in American. Dr. Holt, in your expertise, if a clause bearing the syntactic markers of European transactional law appeared in an American merger agreement, what would that suggest to you about its origins? Fain rose. Objection, Your Honor, calls for speculation. I'm asking for expert opinion within her stated area of expertise, Nia said. Judge Wren considered this. I'll allow it. Witness may answer. Holt looked at Nia with the particular attentiveness of someone who has just realized the person asking questions is more sophisticated than initially apparent. It would suggest, she said carefully, that the clause was either drafted by someone trained in a European legal tradition or was modeled on a European precedent document, rather than originating with Mr. Whitmore's American counsel. That would be a reasonable inference, yes. Thank you, Nia said. No further questions. She sat down. She didn't look at Fain, but she could feel from across the room the specific quality of his silence, the silence of a man recalculating. Paul Reyes called her back that same afternoon during the lunch recess. He had a direct, unhurried voice in the manner of someone for whom precision was not a professional requirement, but a personal orientation. Grant Whitmore asked me to call you, he said. He told me some of what's in play. I want to hear the rest from you. She told him, standing in the courthouse corridor, speaking quietly and completely. She described the USB drive, the routing records, the metadata logs showing account activity before the service existed. She described the memo. She described the VPN routing architecture outlined in the documents as a mechanism for remote signature insertion. Reyes listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, The VPN routing for signature trails, if what you're describing is what I think it is, it leaves digital artifacts that are very difficult to clean. You can obscure the surface, but the underlying packet routing leaves marks in server logs. If those logs still exist, they're verifiable independent of whatever documents you found. Can you verify them in a way that's court admissible? If I have access to the documents and enough time to run the analysis, yes. I've done it before. I testified in the Kellerman case in 2021. You can look it up. How much time do you need? For what you're describing? 3 days minimum for a thorough analysis, 2, if you give me everything organized. I can give you everything organized, she said. Tonight, if you're available. I'll be at my office at 7, he said. She wrote down the address. Then she called the number Grant had given her for Carla Osei at the Tribune. Carla Osei picked up on the first ring, which told Nia something. Reporters who picked up on the first ring were reporters who were always waiting for the call that mattered. Ms. Carter, Carla said, after Nia had given her 30 seconds of context. I've been following this case. I've been following it specifically because the story that's being told about it has some gaps that have been bothering me for months. What kind of gaps? The kind where someone has been very careful about what gets into the record and what doesn't. A pause. I had lunch with Marcus Tilden 6 weeks ago. He was working on something. He wasn't specific, but he was bothered. The kind of bothered that experienced federal defense attorneys don't usually get unless they've found something that makes them reevaluate the whole landscape of a case. Nia was quiet for a moment. Do you know where he is? No. And that scares me more than almost anything else about this situation. Ms. Osei, Carla, I have materials I need to share with you, not for publication yet, for safekeeping and for verification. If something happens to the physical copies, I need to know the information isn't gone. Come to my office, Carla said. Today. I have another meeting at 7. Before 7, then. Nia looked at the corridor around her, the ordinary bustle of lawyers and clerks and worried-looking people clutching manila folders. She thought about the phone call at 11:47. She thought about the memo's budget appendix. She thought about the way Thomas Vale's name had surfaced and then stopped surfacing, the way that traces of people sometimes simply went quiet when they had served their purpose. "Before 7, she said. "Yes." Carla Osei's office at the Tribune was on the 11th floor of a building that smelled like paper and coffee and deadline, and Carla herself was 43, compact, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of focused energy that reminded Nia of her law professors, the ones who had taken her work seriously before the money ran out and she had to leave. They sat across from each other at a cluttered desk, and Nia laid out the structure of what she had found in the same order she'd explained it to Grant, methodical, sequential, letting the internal logic of the evidence build its own argument. Carla didn't take notes. She listened the way Nia had learned to listen, with her whole face, tracking not just the content but the architecture of what was being said. When Nia finished, Carla was quiet for several seconds. "I want to be clear about something," Carla said. "If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just a fraud case where the wrong person is being accused. This is a coordinated scheme involving litigation as a weapon, with forged evidence, potential witness disappearance, and a target acquisition strategy that might have involved SEC-regulated securities. That's a federal criminal investigation, not just a civil dismissal." "I know," Nia said. "That's why I need you to hold copies. If the case gets resolved quietly, if someone pressures the court, or makes the evidence disappear, or if something happens to me—" "Don't say that," Carla said, with a sharpness that wasn't unkind. "I know you need to think about it, but don't make it casual." "I'm not making it casual," Nia said. "I have a daughter. I am not casual about this. But I have to be realistic." She held Carla's gaze. "Will you hold it?" "Yes," Carla said. "On one condition. When this is ready to be reported, I get the story." "You get the story," Nia said. They shook hands across the cluttered desk. Eat. Paul Reyes worked the way Nia imagined surgeons worked, with absolute concentration, an absolute economy of movement, and a very precise vocabulary for what he was seeing. She sat across from him in his Midtown office for 2 hours while he examined the USB drive contents, cross-referenced the routing records with his own forensic tools, and ran the metadata through 3 separate verification programs. He did not make small talk. He occasionally said things like "interesting" or "there it is," in a tone that suggested neither surprise nor satisfaction, just the registration of confirmed expectation. At 9:15, he leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "The routing records are real," he said. "The VPN architecture they use to insert the signature trail is consistent with a technique I've seen used twice before, once in an insurance fraud case in Delaware, once in a corporate espionage case in the Northern District of California. It leaves a very specific artifact in the packet logs." He pulled a printed sheet from his printer and laid it in front of her. "This is what that artifact looks like in the documents you found. And this," he laid a second sheet beside it, "is the same artifact signature from the Northern District case. They're not identical because the operators were different, but the methodology is the same." Nia looked at the 2 sheets. "Can you testify to this?" "I can. I'll need to prepare a full forensic report. That takes 48 hours minimum to do correctly. But yes." He paused. "Ms. Carter, I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "The metadata anomaly. The account activity that predates the service contract. How did you find that?" "I was cross-reading the metadata report and the vendor service agreement, looking for chronological inconsistencies." He looked at her for a moment. "Most people doing that kind of cross-reading would focus on the content. You focused on the timeline." "Timeline inconsistencies are where constructed narratives fall apart," she said. "You can control content. It's much harder to control time." Paul Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you go to law school?" "I didn't finish." He nodded slowly, as though this explained something he had been wondering about. "Well," he said, "you found something that 3 teams of expensive lawyers managed to miss, for whatever that's worth." She gathered her copies of the documents and put them back in her tote. "It's worth about 48 hours, she said, "which is how long I need you to work." He almost smiled. "I'll have the report to you in 48 hours. Not be memorable. Parked on the far side, not be memorable. Parked on the far side of the street, when she left the courthouse that afternoon and now idling at the corner half a block behind her. She had noticed it the first time without registering it consciously, the way you notice things that didn't quite fit the ambient texture of a block. She registered it now because it was moving at the exact pace she was walking and had been for 3 blocks. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She turned right at the next corner away from the subway entrance she had been heading toward and walked 2 blocks, then turned left, then right again, changing her route without any particular urgency but with precision, the way she had learned to navigate on bad streets in the neighborhood where she grew up, when you needed to know whether something behind you was following you or just happening to go the same direction. At the 3rd turn, the car was gone. She stood at the corner for a moment, breathing steadily, feeling the city's ordinary noise around her. Cabs, wind through a construction site, someone's music spilling from an open window, and made herself be calm. Then she took a different subway line home, got off 2 stops early, and walked the last 10 blocks. When she got to her apartment, she checked the door before she opened it. Not the lock, but the small piece of clear tape she had stuck across the door frame and the wall the night before. Low down, where it would be invisible to someone who didn't know to look for it. The tape was undisturbed. She went inside. She checked the windows. She checked Maya's room. Empty. Because Maya was at her grandmother's tonight, a plan Nia had made 3 days ago and was now very grateful for. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and started preparing the documentation summary she would need to bring to Judge Wren. The work was the thing. The work was the answer to the fear, the thing she put between herself and the specific, focused anxiety of knowing that someone had decided she was a problem. She had lived for 28 years in circumstances that were designed at their various worst moments to make her feel like a problem. Too young, too poor, too black, too single, too unfinished in the ways that institutions measured completion. She knew how to work against that. She had been doing it since she was 19 years old and sitting in the first row of a contracts class at NYU Law, the only person in that room who was paying tuition by cleaning offices at night. She worked until 2 in the morning. When she finally stopped, she had a complete document, 43 pages, organized into sections with evidentiary cross-references and timeline notations structured in the format she would need to present it to the court. She saved it to 3 separate cloud accounts, emailed a copy to Carla Osei, and printed 2 hard copies, one for her closet and one for her bag. Then she washed her face, set her alarm, and went to sleep. On the 3rd day of testimony, something changed in the courtroom. It was subtle, the kind of shift that you felt before you could identify it, like the pressure change before a storm. Douglas Fain was conducting his examination of his 4th witness, a financial analyst who had been brought in to reconstruct the economic impact of the disputed escape clause on Aldrich's return on investment. And the examination was going as planned, each question and answer fitting together with the practiced precision of a prepared routine. But the jury, there was no jury in this proceeding. It was a bench trial, Judge Wren presiding alone, wasn't the thing that had shifted. What had shifted was something in the quality of Fain's attention. He was watching Nia. Not openly, not in the way that was legible to the gallery, but she had been watching powerful men conduct themselves in rooms for 6 years, and she could read the specific quality of attention that a person brought to something they were reevaluating. He knew something had changed. He didn't know what yet, but he knew. During the afternoon recess, one of Fain's junior associates, the one with the Rolex whose name turned out to be Harrison Blythe, sat down beside her in the corridor in the tentative way that people sat beside someone when they wanted to say something they hadn't been authorized to say. "Ms. Carter," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not here officially," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "Then why are you here unofficially?" He was young, 26, maybe 27, with the slightly bruised look of someone who had been working long hours on something that had stopped sitting comfortably with him. "There are things about this case that I wasn't told when I joined the team," he said. "Things that have become apparent to me over the past several weeks." Nia kept her face neutral. "What kind of things?" "I can't be specific. I'm still employed by Tilden Greer technically, even though Tilden is, wherever he is." He looked at the floor. "But I want you to know that not everyone on the opposing side of this table is fully informed about everything. Some of us were brought in to do work and told what we needed to know to do that work, and what we needed to know wasn't the whole picture." She studied him. He was afraid, not performing fear, actually afraid, in the way that young people who had made decent choices their whole lives were afraid when they realized the institution they'd joined hadn't made the same kind of choices. "Mr. Blythe," she said, "if you have information that's material to this case, there are processes for disclosing it. I can explain them to you." "I know the processes," he said. "Then you know that acting on what you know is better than sitting next to someone in a courthouse corridor to tell them you have something you won't say." He was quiet. Then he stood up. "I just wanted you to know," he said, "that the laughter, on the first day when you walked in, I didn't laugh." She watched him walk back toward the courtroom. She thought about that for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and sent Carla Osei a text. "One of the junior associates may be wavering. Keep that channel open." Carla responded in 40 seconds. "Already watching him. His name is Blythe?" "Yes," Nia wrote back. "Good. I'll be gentle." The break-in happened that night. She came home from a second meeting with Paul Reyes, who had made significant progress and was confident in the routing record analysis, to find her apartment door unlocked. She stood in the hallway for a full 30 seconds before she went in, and she went in carefully, the way she did everything, with her eyes open and her breathing even and her assessment of the room happening in parallel with her movement through it. Nothing was stolen. That was the first thing she registered. Her laptop was still on the table. Her phone charger was still plugged in. The waterproof bag in her closet was disturbed, moved, not opened, as far as she could tell, though the tape seal showed signs of having been handled. The papers on her kitchen table, which she had left organized in neat piles, were scattered. Not destroyed, not taken, scattered in a way that was specific. A message, not a theft. "We know where you live. We know what you're doing. We can reach you here." She stood in the middle of her kitchen and looked at the scattered papers and felt the particular cold that came not from fear, but from the crystallization of something she had already known into something she could no longer leave in the category of abstract possibility. They were watching her. They could get to her. She picked up her phone and called her mother. "Mama," she said when the line picked up, "I need Maya to stay with you for a few days." "Baby, is everything okay?" "It's fine," she said. "I just have a lot of work, and I don't want her underfoot." The lie came smoothly, practiced in the way that mothers practice lies to protect their children from the weight of things the children couldn't carry yet. "Can you keep her?" "Of course I can keep her. You know I love having her." "Thank you, Mama." She hung up. Then she took the waterproof bag from the closet and checked it. The backup copy was intact. She moved it to a different location, the locked drawer in her bedroom, behind a false bottom she'd created with cardboard and tape 3 years ago, when she'd had documents related to a workers' comp situation for a colleague that she needed to keep private. She was a person who made provisions. She always had been. Then she sat on her bed and allowed herself 60 seconds. 60 seconds exactly, she counted, to feel all the things she was feeling. The fear, the anger, the particular grief of being reminded that some rooms made themselves clear about who they expected to walk out of them and who they expected to stop trying. 60 seconds. Then she got up, went back to the kitchen table, gathered the scattered papers, reorganized them into their correct order, and started working. The next morning, she arrived at the courthouse early again. Grant was already there, and this time his expression when she walked in was different. She could read in him the specific taut alertness of a man who had spent the night with his phone in his hand, waiting for news. "I got a call," he said before she sat. "Anonymous. Same as you described. Low voice, deliberate. They told me to let the case resolve." "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." He watched her set her bag on the table. "I won't, obviously, but I wanted to understand who I was talking to before I said anything useful. What did you hear in the call that told you something?" He considered this. The phrasing, "let the case resolve," not "settle," not "take the deal." Resolve. Like the outcome had already been decided and I was just being offered the courtesy of appearing to cooperate. Nia nodded. The memo uses similar language. Passive voice applied to outcomes that were actively manufactured. She opened her pad. "Grant, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the complete truth." Okay. Is there anything in your actual history with this deal, anything that could be used to construct a parallel argument for your guilt? Something Fain might pivot to if the forensic case starts to fall apart? He held her gaze steadily. No, the deal was clean. I've looked at it from every angle for 8 months, and it's clean. The escape clause, before you knew it was in dispute, did you understand that you were benefiting from it? Yes. My attorneys flagged it as a favorable provision when Heliogen's valuation moved. I asked them to confirm it was in the original agreement. They confirmed it. And Tilden's confirmation? Was in writing, in an email that's in the case record. He paused. Which means Tilden knew, before he disappeared, that the clause was legitimate. Nia looked at him. And that's why he disappeared. The weight of that settled between them. She had been working the evidence, the metadata, the routing records, the memo. But she had been thinking of Tilden's absence as a symptom of the scheme. Now she saw it differently. Tilden hadn't disappeared because he knew too much about their scheme. He had disappeared because he was the one person who could prove the clause was legitimate, and proving it wasn't in the interest of the people who had spent 8 months and an enormous amount of money building the case that it wasn't. We need to find Devora Rice, she said. She's gone dark. People who go dark usually have a reason. Either they're hiding or they're being kept. If she's hiding, she's afraid. And if she's afraid, Nia said, she might also be willing to talk to someone who isn't coming at her as a threat. She wrote the name again at the top of a fresh page. Devora Rice. Then she wrote beneath it, find her before they do. The courtroom doors opened at the far end, and the morning session's attendees began to filter in. Clerks, journalists, a cluster of law students with notebooks, and Douglas Fain's team, moving with their characteristic coordinated precision. Fain himself entered last, and this time he looked directly at Nia as he crossed to his table. He didn't look contemptuous anymore. He looked like a man who was managing something. She looked back at him with steady eyes and thought about the memo in her bag, and the routing records, and the 43-page document she had spent 2 nights building, and the forensic report that Paul Reyes would complete in 36 hours, and the journalist who was holding copies of all of it, and the junior associate who hadn't laughed on the first day and who was visibly reconsidering which side of history he wanted to be on. She thought about all of that, and then she opened her legal pad to a fresh page and waited for Judge Wren to call the court to order. Because the thing about truth, the thing she had understood since she was 19 years old, sitting in the front row of a contracts class and cleaning offices at night to pay for the seat, was that it didn't need help being true. It just needed someone willing to stand in the room and say it out loud. She was very willing. Devora Rice was not hiding. She was waiting. Nia figured that out on a Tuesday morning, 40 minutes before court resumed, when she finally located a forwarding address connected to Devora's last known apartment. A detail buried in a change of address form filed with the Postal Service, cross-referenced against a utility account that had been closed but not yet purged from the public records database she accessed through the law library's terminal. The forwarding address was a P.O. box in Brooklyn. The P.O. box was registered to a name Nia didn't recognize, a woman named Carol Huang, but the zip code matched a neighborhood in Carroll Gardens where, according to a professional directory from 2021, Devora Rice had a cousin who worked as a dental hygienist. People who were hiding didn't file change of address forms. People who were waiting, who had left their previous life deliberately but not permanently, who expected at some point to need their mail forwarded, did. Nia wrote a letter by hand. Not an email, not a text, not anything that moved through a server or left a digital trace. She used paper from a legal pad and a pen she'd had for 3 years, and she wrote plainly and directly, the way she wrote everything. Miss Rice, my name is Nia Carter. I'm working to defend Grant Whitmore. I know what you found. I need to talk to you. No one else knows I'm writing this, and no one will know you responded. You can reach me at the number below. If you don't want to call, you can write back. I'll keep checking the box. I think you left because you were protecting yourself, not because you stopped caring about what was right. I think that's still true. N.C. She mailed it that afternoon, on her way to the courthouse. She did not tell Grant she had sent it because there were certain things she needed to move on alone, and this was one of them. Not because she didn't trust him, because she understood that some people would only speak to someone who wasn't powerful. someone who couldn't protect them with money or connections or institutional weight, but only with the specific gravity of someone who was also, in their own way, out on a limb. 2 days passed. She worked the courtroom in the mornings and the documents at night. Paul Reyes sent her a preliminary version of his forensic report on Thursday afternoon. 18 pages of technical analysis, precisely organized, with a final section that concluded in the measured, unequivocal language of someone who had run the numbers 3 times and arrived at the same answer each time. The VPN routing architecture used to insert the signature trail was not consistent with any legitimate document workflow and showed definitive markers of deliberate, technically sophisticated forgery. She read those 2 words, deliberate and sophisticated, and felt something settle in her chest. Not relief exactly, something more like the specific satisfaction of a proof closing, a thing that was true, that she had known was true, that could now be demonstrated to be true. On Friday morning, the phone rang at 6:47, unknown number. She answered it. "Miss Carter?" "It's..." The voice was a woman's, quiet, careful, carrying the specific flatness of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had organized her voice around not showing it. "This is Devora Rice." Nia sat up straighter. "Thank you for calling." "I almost didn't." A pause. "I've almost done a lot of things in the last few weeks." "I know. I'm glad you called instead." Another pause. Longer. "You said in your letter that you know what I found. What do you know?" "I know you found a metadata anomaly that predates the service contract. I know you flagged it to Tilden, and I know that shortly after that, both of you became very difficult to locate." The silence on the line had a particular quality, not the silence of someone who was deciding whether to trust, but the silence of someone who had already decided and was allowing herself to feel the relief of that decision. "Tilden told me to stop working the case," Devora said. "He said he needed time to think. That was 10 days before his scheduled court appearance. I thought he was being cautious. Then I stopped hearing from him, and I realized cautious wasn't the right word." Her voice tightened slightly. "What I found wasn't just the metadata anomaly. I found something else. Something that I didn't put in any file and didn't tell anyone about because I didn't understand it yet." Nia was very still. "What did you find?" "A name. In the document service's backend logs, I had access because Tilden's firm used the same service for client document storage, and I had an admin credential. I was running a routine check and I found a user account that had accessed our client folder. Not the Whitmore folder specifically, the folder structure above it, which contained client metadata. Someone accessed your firm's document architecture from the outside, using an internal credential that had been inactive for 2 years, a former paralegal who left the firm in 2019. Devora paused. His name was Thomas Vale. The name landed the way it always did when a piece she already had connected to a piece she was still building, with a specific, clarifying weight. "I know that name," Nia said. "Then you know more than I did when I first found it." Another pause. "Miss Carter, I need you to understand something. I left because I was scared. I'm still scared. But I've been sitting in my cousin's apartment for 3 weeks thinking about what it means to know something and do nothing with it, and Her voice broke very slightly, then recovered. "I can't keep doing nothing." "You don't have to," Nia said, "but I need you to do something specific, and I need you to be protected when you do it." "What do you need?" "I need you to testify. Under protection. Formal protection, which I'm going to work to arrange before I ask you to say yes to anything. But I need your account of what you found in those logs, and I need it in a form the court can use." The silence lasted a full 10 seconds. "Okay," Devora said, "but I need to know you can actually do something with it. I need to know this isn't going to disappear." "It's not going to disappear," Nia said. "I have copies in 4 places. I have a forensic technologist who has verified the routing records. I have a journalist holding everything. And I have 43 pages of evidentiary documentation that I'm presenting to the court next week." She paused. "The truth is too distributed to disappear now." She could hear Devora breathing on the other end of the line. Steady, deliberate, the breath of someone organizing themselves around a decision they had already made and were now committing to fully. "I'll testify," Devora said. Wilton. She told Grant that evening in the conference room of his attorney's temporary office, a space borrowed from a colleague of Tilden's, small and slightly too warm and smelling of old coffee and new anxiety. Grant listened with his hands flat on the table, his face very still. She can place Veil inside the document services architecture, Nia said. Combined with the routing records, the metadata anomaly, and the memo that closes the last gap in the chain of access, we can show who had the ability to insert the clause, how it was done technically, and that the authorization for it connects to the litigation strategy outlined in the memo. It connects Veil to Aldrich, Grant said. His employment history connects him to Aldrich. His access to the document service connects him to the mechanism. The memo connects the mechanism to a deliberate strategy. And the budget line, she opened her legal pad to the relevant page, connects the strategy to a financial decision authorized at a senior level. Grant looked at the page for a moment. Fain is going to challenge everything. The memo's provenance, the chain of custody for the USB drive, the admissibility of Devora's testimony if she's not currently employed in a relevant capacity. I know. That's why I'm going to present the forensic report first and build the evidentiary foundation before I introduce the memo. She paused. I also think we need to move now, not at the end of Fain's case, not in some planned dramatic sequence. I think we need to request an emergency evidentiary hearing before he finishes his witness list. Grant looked at her. Why now? Because Blythe is wavering. She had told him about the courthouse corridor conversation 2 days ago. And if Blythe is wavering, Fain knows his team is porous. If he knows his team is porous, he's going to start managing what information gets into the record and what doesn't. The window where we can put this in front of the judge before they can structure a response is closing. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, you want to force the moment. I want to choose it, she said. There's a difference. He almost smiled. It was, she had observed, a rare expression for him. Not because he was humorless, but because in the present circumstances, the muscles required for it seemed to have been recruited for other uses. All right, he said. Request the hearing. She filed the request with the court's clerk at 8:15 the next morning, before the day's session began. A formal motion requesting an emergency evidentiary hearing on the basis of newly discovered evidence material to the defense. She attached a summary of the evidence to be presented, authenticated by Paul Reyes's preliminary forensic findings, and supported by the SEC filing cross-reference she had already introduced into the record. Judge Wren reviewed it during the morning recess. She called both parties into her chambers at 11:30, a small, serious room lined with legal volumes and one framed photograph that Nia couldn't see clearly from where she stood, of what might have been a mountain or might have been a shoreline. Judge Wren sat behind her desk and read the motion summary twice, in silence, with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who intended to understand exactly what she was being asked to do before she responded to it. Douglas Fain sat across from Nia in one of the leather chairs arranged before the desk, in the specific taut stillness of a man who was managing an emotion he had decided not to show. Miss Carter, Judge Wren said, setting the summary down, you are representing to this court that you have obtained evidence demonstrating that the document at the center of this dispute was fraudulently altered, not by the defendant, but by a third party operating in coordination with the plaintiff's financial interests. Yes, Your Honor. And this evidence includes a memorandum, a digital forensic analysis of routing records, and the anticipated testimony of a witness who can place the relevant third party within the document service used to execute the alteration. Yes, Your Honor. Where did you obtain the memorandum? From a storage unit accessible with a code referenced in court documents connected to this case, Your Honor. The unit was registered to a document services company whose technical consultant is the same individual I can connect to the fraudulent access. Fain spoke for the first time. Your Honor, the plaintiff has serious concerns about the provenance of these alleged materials. A document obtained from a storage unit by an individual with no formal authority, in this case, raises obvious chain of custody issues. The chain of custody concerns are precisely why I've had the digital materials independently verified by a credentialed forensic technologist before presenting them, Nia said. Paul Reyes of Reyes Digital Forensics, who has testified in this district before. His full report will accompany the evidentiary submission. Judge Wren looked at both of them for a moment. Then she looked at Nia specifically, with an expression that was not warm and was not cold, but was the expression of a judge deciding whether the thing she was looking at was real. "I'm going to grant a preliminary evidentiary review," she said. "I will examine the submitted materials with the court's forensic specialist before determining whether to schedule a full evidentiary hearing. Mr. Fain, you will have the opportunity to respond to the materials once they have been reviewed. We will reconvene on this matter in 4 days." Fain stood. "Your Honor, I'd request that in the interim, the court consider whether these proceedings should be—" "Mr. Fain," Judge Wren said, with the particular tone of someone who had been a federal judge for 16 years and was done being managed, "I am fully capable of determining what these proceedings should be. Thank you." He left first. At the door, he paused and looked back at Nia in the specific way that she had been looked at in rooms her whole life, assessed, classified, filed under a category. But the category had changed. She could see it in his face. She was no longer the housekeeper in the apron who was good for a laugh on the first day. She was something he hadn't planned for, and that reclassification was written plainly in the tight line of his jaw. She looked back at him with the same steady expression she had been looking at powerful men with since she was 22, and said nothing, and after a moment he walked out. Judge Wren, who had watched this exchange, said quietly, "Ms. Carter." Nia turned. "Your Honor? Make sure your documentation is complete and your witness is protected." A pause. Not a warm pause, but a precise one. "I don't grant emergency hearings lightly." "I understand, Your Honor." "Then we understand each other." The judge looked back down at her desk. 4 days. The next 72 hours moved with the specific quality of time under pressure. Each hour distinct and fully loaded, no gap between the end of one task and the beginning of the next. Nia coordinated with Paul Reyes to finalize his report, which came to 23 pages in its complete form and was, she thought, reading it in its entirety for the first time, one of the most methodically devastating documents she had ever seen. It didn't argue. It didn't editorialize. It simply showed, in precise technical language, what the evidence demonstrated. And what it demonstrated was comprehensive and internally consistent and pointed in only one direction. She met with Devora Rice in person for the first time on the second day, in a coffee shop in Park Slope, 3 blocks from Devora's cousin's apartment. Devora was 31, with the composed, careful manner of someone who had learned to hold themselves together by the structure of their own attention. She was also, Nia observed, angry. Not visibly, not performed, but with the specific sustained anger of someone who had been made to feel afraid for things that weren't their fault and had spent 3 weeks sitting with that anger alone. They sat across from each other with coffee going cold between them, and Nia walked her through the process. What testifying under protection would mean, what the court could offer, what Nia herself could and couldn't promise. She was direct about the limits. She did not oversell what she had. She had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do to a witness was give them expectations you couldn't meet. "I can't promise you nothing will happen after this," she said. "I can promise you that the evidence is strong enough that the case against Grant Whitmore is going to fall apart in that courtroom. What happens after that, the criminal referral, the investigation into Aldrich, that's beyond my control. But the story will be public. It'll be documented. It'll be reported." She paused. "Carla Osei at the Tribune is holding everything. Whatever happens to me, to you, to the physical documents, the story exists." Devora wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table. "When Marcus Tilden told me to stop working the case," she said, "I thought he was protecting himself. But then I found the Vail access log and I thought, he knew. He found what I found or found something bigger, and he told me to stop because he was trying to protect me too." She looked up. He was a complicated man. He cared about his reputation above almost everything else. But he wasn't dirty. I know that. He wasn't dirty. "I know," Nia said. "And whatever happened to him, the truth about this case is the best thing we can do for him too." Devora nodded. One precise, resolved nod. The nod of a decision that had already been made and was now being formally registered. "Tell me what you need me to say," she said. "Just what you found," Nia said. "Exactly what you found. In your own words, in the order you found it. That's all." On the evening before the preliminary evidentiary review, Nia's apartment was broken into for the second time. This time was different. She came home at 9:30 to find the tape disturbed again. But this time the door itself was slightly ajar, and when she pushed it open, the living room was not scattered, but searched. Methodical. The kind of search that was done by someone who knew what they were looking for. Drawers pulled out and replaced, cabinet doors opened and closed, the kitchen table cleared, and the papers she'd left on it reorganized with an attention to detail that was more unsettling than destruction would have been. The false bottom drawer in her bedroom opened, the waterproof bag gone. She stood in the middle of her bedroom and breathed. 1 breath. 2. The specific controlled breathing she did when she needed to not let the thing happening to her happen inside her. They had taken the backup copy, the one in the closet, but not the copies distributed elsewhere, not the copy at her sister's in Philadelphia, not the digital copies in the cloud accounts, not the copy Carla Osei was holding, not Paul Reyes's independent forensic analysis, which existed entirely separately from anything they could reach in her apartment, not Devorah Rice's testimony, which was in the woman herself, in her memory and her voice and her willingness to walk into a courtroom and say what she knew. She had planned for this. She had planned for all of this. She sat on the edge of her bed and called Carla. "They got one of the physical backups," she said without preamble. "The one at your apartment?" "Yes." "The rest is intact?" "Everything I sent you, everything in the cloud. Paul's report, Devorah." She paused. "I want to move up the hearing." "You can't move up a federal judge's timeline." "I know, but I want you to be ready. The moment Judge Wren schedules the full evidentiary hearing, I want you to publish the preliminary summary we discussed. Not the full story, just enough to create a public record that these materials exist and have been submitted to the court." A brief silence on Carla's end. "If I publish that, it tips Fine that there's a press angle he needs to manage. It also makes the evidence impossible to disappear," Nia said. "Once it's in the Tribune, even as a summary, it's public record. They can break into my apartment every night for a year, and it won't change what's already been printed." Another silence, longer. "You're using publication as protection." "Yes." "That's actually a very good use of journalism," Carla said, with a tone that was both professional and, just barely, admiring. "Okay, I'll be ready the moment the hearing is scheduled." After she hung up, Nia went to the kitchen and made tea, the thing she did when she needed her hands busy and her mind clear, and stood at the window looking out at the city, at the specific texture of East Harlem at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, the laundromat still lit across the street, the bodega's neon sign, the sound of music from someone's window 3 floors up. She thought about what it had taken to get here. Not in self-pity, she had very little patience for that, but in the specific practical accounting of someone who needed to understand all the resources she had used and what remained. She was tired. That was real. She was scared in the deep, sustained way that wasn't dramatic but was present, a low, persistent hum beneath everything else. She missed Maya with a physical ache, the comfortable weight of her daughter reading beside her on the couch, the ease of an ordinary evening that had nothing in it except the two of them. But she was also, and she let herself feel this, because it was true and she had earned it, clear. Clearer than she had been about anything in years. The clarity of knowing exactly where she was, exactly what she had, and exactly what needed to happen next. She finished her tea. She went back to the table. She opened her laptop. The preliminary evidentiary review happened on a gray Thursday morning, in a closed session in Judge Wren's courtroom with only the parties' representatives and the court's own forensic specialist present. The court specialist, a woman named Dr. Ingrid Torres, compact and methodical, who had done forensic work for the Southern District for 11 years, examined Paul Reyes' full report, cross-referenced his methodology against her own independent tools, and then looked at the primary digital materials for 40 minutes in silence, while everyone else in the room tried to breathe normally. Nia watched Douglas Fain during those 40 minutes. He sat very still, with his legal pad open and his pen in his hand, and he didn't write anything. The stillness of a man who was good enough at his job to understand that something had changed and disciplined enough not to show it. One of his associates, not Blythe, one of the others, leaned close to him at one point and whispered something. Fain shook his head, a tiny, precise motion, and the associate sat back. Doctor. Torres completed her review, made notes in a file, and looked at Judge Wren. Your Honor, she said, the forensic methodology in the submitted report is sound. The routing record analysis is consistent with established digital forensic standards. The metadata anomaly identified is real, and the explanation provided for it is technically coherent. She paused. The materials are authentic to the extent I can determine in this preliminary review. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms went quiet when something significant happened that everyone present understood they would remember. Judge Wren wrote something on her notepad. Then she looked at both parties over her reading glasses. I'm scheduling a full evidentiary hearing, she said, 1 week from today. Both parties will have the opportunity to present and challenge the evidence. Mr. Fain, you will have until Monday to file any motions regarding the admissibility of the submitted materials. She looked at Nia. Ms. Carter, your witness needs to be formally listed and protective measures coordinated with the court's marshal service by end of business Friday. Yes, Your Honor, Nia said. We're adjourned. The room began to move, chairs pushing back, papers gathering, the ordinary displacement of people resuming their ordinary activity after an extraordinary moment. Nia sat still for a second, organizing the specific feeling of this, the hearing scheduled, the forensic validation obtained, the week ahead with its particular weight and shape and danger. Then Fawn stopped beside her table on his way out. He didn't sit. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked down at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not contempt, not the careful management of someone reassessing a threat, but something older and more complicated. Ms. Carter, he said. She looked up at him. For what it's worth, he said quietly, so that only she could hear. When they told me this case was straightforward, I believed them. I want you to know that. She held his gaze for a moment. Were you told that by Aldrich or by someone at your firm? Something moved across his face. That's a question I've been asking myself, he said, since about Wednesday. He walked out. She watched him go and thought about what that meant, about the specific revelation that came when a man like Douglas Fain, with all his experience and all his preparation and all his practiced authority, began to understand that he had been the most sophisticated prop in someone else's machine. She picked up her bag and walked toward the doors, and as she pushed through them into the courthouse corridor, her phone buzzed with a message from Carla Osi. 3 words, ready when you are. She wrote back, 1 week. Then she put her phone in her pocket and walked toward the elevator. And the elevator doors opened and she stepped in and the doors closed and she stood alone in the small mirrored box of it, looking at herself. At the work uniform she was still wearing because she'd had a 7 a.m. shift before the review. At the legal pad tucked under her arm. At the woman who had walked into this courtroom 11 days ago in a housekeeper's apron while people filmed her and laughed, and she did not look away from herself. She was still there, still standing, still holding. The elevator arrived at the lobby and she walked out into the gray morning, and the city came at her the way it always did. Full, loud, indifferent, hers, and she walked into it with everything she had built and everything she still needed to do ahead of her, one step at a time, the way she had always moved through the rooms that weren't built for her. Forward. The week before the evidentiary hearing was the longest week of Nia Carter's life, and she had lived through some long ones. She measured it not in days, but in the accumulation of pressure, the kind that didn't announce itself dramatically but settled into the body incrementally, the way cold settled into a room when the heat went out, degree by degree until you realized you had been shivering for an hour without noticing. She slept in 4-hour segments. She ate standing up at her kitchen counter because sitting down felt like conceding time she didn't have. She called Maya every evening at 7:30 and listened to her daughter talk about school and her grandmother's cooking and a disagreement with a friend named Jasmine. And she laughed at the right moments and asked the right questions and kept her voice exactly the way Maya needed it to be. Steady, warm, present. And then hung up and went back to the table and the documents and the specific, relentless architecture of preparing an evidentiary case that had to be right the first time because there might not be a second. On Monday, Fain filed 2 motions, one challenging the chain of custody of the memo and USB drive obtained from the storage unit, One arguing that Devorah Rice's anticipated testimony lacked foundation given her departure from Tilden Greer under unspecified circumstances. Both motions were professionally written and legally coherent and told Nia something important. Fain was fighting process, not substance. When a lawyer stopped challenging the evidence itself and started challenging the mechanism by which it arrived, it meant the evidence was holding. She filed responses to both motions on Wednesday. The chain of custody response leaned heavily on Paul Reyes's independent forensic verification. If the digital materials could be authenticated independently of their physical source, the question of how she had obtained the physical source became significantly less determinative. The Devorah Rice response was simpler. Devorah's testimony was not being offered as expert analysis, but as fact witness testimony about specific actions she had personally observed in documents she had personally accessed during her employment. Her circumstances of departure were irrelevant to the factual content of what she had seen. Judge Wren denied both motions on Thursday morning, in a ruling that was brief and precise and contained in its final paragraph a single sentence that Nia read 3 times. The court finds that the interests of justice require the fullest possible examination of the submitted evidence, and declines to foreclose that examination on procedural grounds that do not rise to the level of constitutional or statutory requirement. She printed that paragraph and taped it to the wall above her kitchen table, not as a celebration, but as a reminder. The door was open. What happened next depended on what she did with it. The envelope appeared under her door on Thursday night. Not a letter. There was no letter inside. Just a photograph, printed on plain copy paper, slightly overexposed in the way of something taken from a distance with a long lens. It showed Maya, in her school coat and backpack, walking with Nia's mother on the sidewalk outside PS 83. The timestamp in the corner read 2 days ago. Nia stood in her doorway holding the photograph for a very long time. The specific quality of what she felt in that moment was not something she had words for in the moment. It was larger than fear and more focused than rage, and it had a texture to it, like something she was holding physically, something with weight. She had understood from the beginning that whoever was behind this was willing to reach into her life and move things around. The phone call, the break-ins, the car following her. But this was different. This was her daughter, her 8-year-old daughter who thought she knew how to fix anything, walking home from school with her grandmother 2 days ago, while someone with a camera stood on the sidewalk and pointed it at her. She called her mother first. "Mama, I need you to change Maya's routine starting tomorrow. Don't take the same route to school. Don't pick her up at the regular time. And don't let anyone approach her that you don't know." "Nia," her mother's voice dropped. "What is happening? I'm handling it. I just need you to do what I'm asking. Tell me what's happening." "I will. When it's over, I'll tell you everything. Right now, I need you to trust me." A long silence. Her mother had raised 3 children in circumstances that required a specific kind of trust. The trust of people who had learned to believe in each other's competence because it was the only infrastructure they had. "Okay," she said. "Okay, baby, I'll keep her safe. I know you will." She hung up. Then she photographed the envelope and its contents, emailed the images to Carla Osei, Paul Reyes, and the email address she had created specifically for backing up evidence that might be needed later. Then she called Carla. "They sent a photograph of my daughter," she said. The silence on Carla's end lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then, "I'm publishing the preliminary summary tomorrow morning. I was going to wait until the hearing was called to order, but I'm not waiting anymore." "That was my call to make," Nia said. "It's still your call, but I want you to know what I think." Nia looked at the photograph. Maya's school coat, the purple one with the yellow zipper that Maya had picked out herself and wore with an 8-year-old's absolute conviction. "Publish it," she said. "Tomorrow morning." "I'll file it tonight," Carla said. "It'll be live by 6 a.m. Include that witness protection has been coordinated with the court's marshal service for at least 1 witness. That'll signal to them that Devorah is under protection." "That's the point," Nia said. "I want them to know that threatening a witness they can't reach is all they have left." The Tribune article ran at 6:14 a.m. on Friday under Carla Osei's byline, beneath a headline that was precise and declarative. "Defense submits evidence of alleged fraud scheme in Whitmore case. Evidentiary hearing scheduled." Nia read it on her phone while her coffee brewed. It was exactly what they had agreed on. A factual summary of the defense's evidentiary submission, the scheduling of the hearing, and a single paragraph noting that the submitted materials included digital forensic analysis by a credentialed expert and the anticipated testimony of a fact witness currently under court protection. No speculation, no editorial. Just the architecture of what was happening, laid out in clean newspaper prose for anyone who wanted to understand the shape of it. By 7 a.m., it had been picked up by 2 financial news wires. By 8, it was in the Journal's digital digest. By the time Nia walked into the courthouse at 8:45, 3 reporters she didn't know were waiting outside the entrance with cameras, and one of them called her name as she approached. She stopped. She had thought about this moment, the first moment when the public dimension of the case shifted, when it stopped being a courtroom proceeding and became something that moved through the world in the faster, louder, less controllable way that things moved when journalists and cameras got hold of them. She had prepared a sentence, 12 words. She had written it out and memorized it the way she memorized contract language, precisely, without variation. "The evidence speaks for itself," she said. "We'll let the hearing do its work." She walked inside. Grant was already at the defense table, and he was not alone. Beside him sat a man Nia hadn't met, late 40s, with the composed, expensive manner of a senior attorney, wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. Grant stood when she came in. "This is Daniel Marsh," he said. "He's a partner at Greenfield Coal. He's agreed to formally join the defense." Nia looked at Daniel Marsh. He looked back at her with an expression that was professional, and she thought genuinely respectful. Not the performance of respect that powerful men sometimes offered to people they were managing, but the actual thing, the kind that came from having read a file and understood what was in it. "Ms. Carter," Marsh said, extending his hand. "I've reviewed everything you've built. It's thorough doesn't begin to cover it." "Mr. Marsh," she said, shaking his hand, "you understand I'm not stepping back." "I would not ask you to," he said. Grant made that very clear. "I'm here to support the process, not to replace what you've done." He paused. "I can file formal motions, examine witnesses on the record in ways that are procedurally cleaner, that protects the case. But the strategy, the evidentiary structure, the witness preparation, that's yours." She looked at Grant. "I should have gotten someone to support you sooner," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't." She considered this. The apology, the admission, the way it was offered without performance. She had observed that Grant Whitmore apologized the way he listened, directly, without decoration, without making the apology about himself. "Okay," she said. "Then let me tell you both what the next 6 days look like." What the next 6 days looked like was this. Preparation so complete that it left no surface unexamined, no question unanswered, no potential challenge unaddressed. She and Marsh worked in parallel, him managing the procedural framework, her managing the evidentiary substance, in a collaboration that had, to her mild surprise, almost no friction. Marsh was good at his job in the way that people were good at things they had been doing for 25 years, and he was also, she discovered, genuinely troubled by the case. Not in the theatrical way. In the quiet way of a senior attorney who had spent his career believing in the integrity of the legal system and was now sitting across from evidence that the system had been used as a weapon. "The budget line," he said, on the second evening of their preparation, looking at the memo's appendix. "Litigation leverage. I've been in this business for 26 years, and I've never seen a document where the lawsuit was literally budgeted as a line item in an acquisition strategy." "Most people don't write things down," Nia said. "No, most people are smarter than this." He looked up. "Which makes me think this memo was written by someone who believed it would never be found. Someone who was confident enough in the architecture of the scheme to be explicit about it in an internal document." "Thomas Vale," Nia said. "Or whoever was directing Vale." Marsh paused. "The memo is unsigned. We have the routing records connecting Vale to the document service. We have Devora's testimony connecting Vale to the unauthorized access. But the authorization chain, the evidence connecting the decision to use litigation as leverage to specific senior decision-makers at Aldrich, that chain is in the emails on the USB drive, which Paul's report authenticates as unaltered. Yes, but Fain is going to go after the authentication hard. He'll bring his own expert." Marsh closed the memo. "We need Paul on the stand being unshakable." Paul Reyes is constitutionally incapable of being shakeable, Naya said. I've spent 30 hours with him. The man doesn't have a gear for uncertainty. Marsh almost smiled. Good, because Fawn is going to bring everything he has. What Fane brought, as it turned out, was starting to fracture. Harrison Blythe called Nia on the 4th day before the hearing. Not from his office line, from a personal cell she hadn't seen before, which told her he had made a decision about the call before he made the call. Ms. Carter, he said, I have something I need to tell someone. Tell me, she said. 3 weeks before this trial began, I was asked to prepare a summary memo on the Whitmore contract documents, specifically on the escape clause. My supervising partner reviewed my memo and told me I had identified an inconsistency that was, and I'm quoting, not useful to the case narrative and should be removed from the final version. Nia held the phone very still. What inconsistency? The syntactic pattern, he said, the European-style arbitration language. I flagged it because it was anomalous for a domestic merger agreement of this type. I was told to remove the flag. A pause. I removed it. She breathed. Mr. Blythe, are you willing to say that in a formal proceeding? I'm willing to say it to you right now, which I think is what matters more at the moment. He sounded, she thought, like someone who had been carrying something for weeks and had finally put it down, lighter and also slightly unsteady from the lightness, the way muscles were unsteady after releasing a sustained tension. I'm not... He stopped, started again. I'm not dirty. I want you to know that. I followed an instruction I should have questioned, and I've been sitting with that for 3 weeks. And the photograph in the Tribune this morning... He stopped. What about it? She said. There was a photograph of you in the Tribune this morning, outside the courthouse, and you looked... Another pause. You looked like someone who was going to finish this regardless of what it cost. And I thought about that. His voice was steadier now. I thought about what it must have cost you to walk into that courtroom on the first day, to just walk in there and say what you said, knowing what the room was going to do. She was quiet for a moment. What will it cost you to say what you just told me in a formal context? My job, he said. Probably my reputation in certain circles for a while. He paused. But not the other things. The things that are harder to recover. I can connect you with Daniel Marsh, she said. He can advise you on how to make a formal disclosure in a way that protects you legally. You should have counsel before you take any formal step. I know, he said. I just needed to say it to someone first. I heard you, she said. I'm glad you called. She told Marsh about Blythe's call that evening. He listened with his eyes half closed, the expression he used when he was processing something significant without reacting to it immediately. He flagged the European language pattern, Marsh said, and was told to remove it, which means someone at Tilden Greer knew about the syntactic anomaly and suppressed it. Which means someone at Tilden Greer was... He stopped. Connected to the scheme, Naya said, or knew someone who was. They sat with that for a moment. The specific implication of it, that Marcus Tilden's firm, the firm paid $3 million to defend Grant Whitmore, had also been compromised at some level, added a dimension to the case that neither of them had fully articulated before. It also explained, in a way that nothing else had quite explained, why Tilden had vanished. Not because he had been threatened into silence, but because he had found the same thing Blythe had found, had understood its implication for his own firm, and had done something, gone somewhere, made a decision that no one had been told about yet. We need to find Tilden, Marsh said. I've been trying, Nia said, but if he went to ground voluntarily, we can't force him out. And if he didn't... She didn't finish the sentence. Marsh looked at her. The hearing is in 3 days. What do we do if Tilden doesn't surface? We present what we have, she said. The Blythe disclosure, if he formalizes it, adds weight to the picture. But the core case doesn't depend on Tilden. It depends on the documents, the forensics, and Devora. You're confident in Devora? Yes. She said it without hesitation, because it was true. In the days since Devora had agreed to testify, she had met with her 4 times, and each time Devora had demonstrated the specific quality that made a fact witness reliable. Not the performance of certainty, but the consistency of someone who was simply describing what they had seen, in the same order and with the same details each time, because they had actually seen it. "Then we go forward," Marsh said. "We go forward," Nia agreed. On the night before the hearing, she went to pick up Maya. Her mother met her at the door of the apartment in the Bronx where Nia had grown up, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Her mother just looked at her, the way mothers looked at daughters when they understood the full weight of what the daughter was carrying and knew that saying so would not help. "She's been asking when you're coming," her mother said. "I'm here now." Maya came running from the back room and hit Nia with the full momentum of an 8-year-old who had been practicing patience and had used all of it up. Nia crouched and caught her and held on. Not briefly, not the quick hug of a distracted parent, but for a real moment, long enough that Maya relaxed fully into it, long enough that Nia felt the particular grounding of holding something that mattered completely. "Hi, Mama," Maya said into her shoulder. "Hi, baby," Nia said. They sat on the couch together for an hour, and Maya told her about the field trip and the permission slip, returned it turned out, by Nia's mother, and Jasmine and the disagreement, which had been resolved, and a book she was reading about a girl who solved mysteries. Nia listened to all of it and contributed at the right moments and was, for that hour, entirely and only there. Her mother brought tea and sat in the armchair across from them, and didn't say anything about the case, or the Tribune article, or the photograph under the door, and Nia was grateful for this with a specific, uncomplicated gratitude. When Maya had fallen asleep on the couch, Nia's mother said quietly, "You're going to win." Nia looked at her. "You don't know that." "No," her mother said, "but I know you." She folded her hands in her lap. "I watched you work 3 jobs and study and raise that child and hold yourself together when everything was against you. And I know you don't walk into rooms to lose. You walk in because you've already figured out how." Nia looked at her sleeping daughter. "It's more complicated than just figuring out how." "It always is," her mother said. "That's never stopped you." She was back in her own apartment by 11. She did not open the laptop. She did not look at the documents. She had done everything she could do, and the specific discipline of preparation required knowing when the preparation was complete. Instead, she stood at the window and looked at the city the way she had looked at it 11 days ago, when she had first found the memo and stood at the same window with the shape of the truth in her hands. The city looked the same. It always looked the same from this window, which was one of the things she valued about it. Its indifference, its continuity, the way it kept being exactly itself regardless of what was happening in any individual life within it. She had, she thought, the same quality. Not indifference. She was not indifferent to any of this, but continuity. The capacity to keep being herself, to keep going forward, regardless of what the rooms decided about her. Tomorrow, the hearing would begin. Tomorrow, the evidence would go in front of Judge Wren and Douglas Fain, and whatever remained of Aldrich Capital's legal strategy after the fractures of the past week. Tomorrow, Devorah Rice would walk into a federal courtroom and say what she had seen, and Paul Reyes would explain what the data showed, and Daniel Marsh would present the formal architecture, and she, Nia Carter, 28 years old, housekeeper at the Meridian Grand, incomplete law degree, single mother, woman in an apron who people had filmed on the first day because they thought she was a joke, would stand in that room and see it through. Her phone buzzed. A text from Carla Osei. "Ready for tomorrow. Whatever happens, the story is already written. They can't unwrite it." She looked at that for a moment. Then she typed back, "They're going to try anyway." Carla's response came in less than a minute. "Let them. That's what we're there for." She set the phone on the table. Then the second text came in, from a number she didn't have saved but recognized from the single time she had called it, Paul Reyes. 3 words and a period, in the economy of a man who chose his words with the same precision he brought to his forensic analysis. Report is airtight. And then, a moment later, a text from Devorah Rice. Not a long message, just, "I'm ready. See you in there." Nia read all 3 messages twice. Then she put the phone down, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. She slept for 6 hours, deeply, without interruption, the sleep of someone who had done the work and could do nothing more tonight to change what would happen in the morning. There was a particular peace in that, she had learned, not certainty. She had never required certainty, just the knowledge that she had given everything she had to give, and that what remained was the truth, and the truth was going to have to be enough. Outside her window, the city continued its indifferent and magnificent existence, full of ordinary people going about the ordinary work of their ordinary lives, none of them aware that in one apartment on East 117th Street, a woman who had been laughed at 11 days ago was sleeping quietly while the case she had built waited in the morning like a door she was prepared to walk through. She had always been good at walking through doors. Tomorrow, she would show them how. The morning of the evidentiary hearing arrived the way important mornings always arrived, looking exactly like every other morning, indifferent to its own significance. Nia was up at 5:15. She made coffee. She ironed the one blazer she owned that was appropriate for a federal courtroom. Dark navy, bought 3 years ago for a job interview she had ultimately not gotten, worn twice since. She put it on over a white blouse and stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment, not examining herself for reassurance, but simply registering who was going to walk into that room today. Then she picked up her bag, which contained 43 pages of evidentiary documentation, Paul Reyes's 23-page forensic report, 2 printed copies of the key emails from the USB drive, the memo and its budget appendix, and the legal pad she had been writing on since the first day. She took one last look at the kitchen table, cleared now for the first time in 2 weeks, and walked out. The courthouse steps were busy at 8:30 in a way they hadn't been on the first day. Carla's article had done what Distributed Truth was supposed to do. It had made the hearing legible to people who had no previous reason to follow it. There were 12 reporters outside, including 2 television cameras, and a cluster of people who appeared to have come simply to watch. The way people came to watch things that felt historically weighted, even when they couldn't have precisely articulated why. Nia walked through them without stopping. One reporter called her name, and she turned just enough to acknowledge the call without slowing down. "Miss Carter, are you confident going into today?" She thought about the question for exactly 1 step. Then she said, "I'm prepared," and kept walking. Inside, the courtroom was fuller than it had been at any point in the preceding 2 weeks. The gallery was 3/4 full. Journalists, financial industry observers, a row of law students who had apparently been told by someone that this was worth seeing. Daniel Marsh was already at the defense table, his briefcase open, his expression the composed, battle-ready calm of a man who had been in high-stakes courtrooms for a quarter century and had learned to locate his stillness before the room came to order. Grant was there. He looked, she thought, different from how he had looked on the first day. Less like a man standing on cracking ice, and more like a man who had decided to stand his ground regardless of what the ice did. He stood when she came in, which he always did, a habit she had stopped noticing and now noticed again because of what it meant in this particular room, on this particular morning. "How are you?" he said. "Ready?" she said. "You?" "Ready," he said. They sat down together. Across the room, Douglas Fain was organizing his materials with the meticulous efficiency of someone who had been in rooms like this for 3 decades and understood that the preparation that happened in the 30 minutes before a proceeding was as important as anything that happened in the weeks before it. He had 2 associates with him today. Blythe was not among them. She had noted Blythe's absence and registered what it meant without needing to dwell on it. Harrison Blythe had spoken to Daniel Marsh's paralegal on Wednesday afternoon and had submitted a formal disclosure to the court on Thursday. He was no longer employed by Tilden Greer. He was, as of this morning, a person who had made the harder choice, and he would live with the consequences of that, and they would be both worse and better than he currently understood. Judge Wren entered at 9 a.m. precisely, and the room came to order with the specific quality of attention that a full gallery brought to a proceeding, not the practiced attentiveness of lawyers and clerks, but the wider, less disciplined attention of people who were there because something real was happening and they wanted to see it. "We're here today for the full evidentiary hearing on defense submissions in the matter of Aldrich Capital Partners versus Grant Whitmore," Judge Wren said. She looked at the room over her reading glasses in a way that communicated, without words, that she was aware of the cameras outside and the journalists in the gallery and was entirely unbothered by both. "I want to be clear about the scope of today's proceedings. We are not relitigating the prior testimony. We are examining specific newly submitted evidence and hearing testimony directly related to that evidence. Both parties will have the opportunity to present and challenge. We will be thorough and we will be orderly. She looked at Naya. Miss Carter, you may proceed. She started with Paul Reyes. She had thought carefully about the order, had gone back and forth between Devora and Paul, had talked it through with Marsh at length. Marsh had initially wanted Devora first, on the theory that human testimony created emotional context before technical evidence. Nia had overruled him, respectfully and firmly, because she understood something about this particular judge and this particular case that the ordering needed to reflect. Judge Wren was a fact-first jurist. She had read the preliminary summary and granted the hearing because the forensic foundation was sound. The right way to honor that was to put the forensic foundation in front of her first, let it stand on its own terms, and then let Devora's testimony show the human dimension of what the numbers described. Paul Reyes took the stand and was everything she had told Marsh he would be. He was precise without being cold, technical without being inaccessible, and he had the specific quality of unshakable that came not from arrogance but from having done the work so thoroughly. The challenge was simply another form of confirmation. He walked the court through his methodology with the patience of someone explaining a proof to a curious student. Not condescending, genuinely engaged, treating the work as the interesting thing it was. Fain's cross-examination was extensive and professionally aggressive. He challenged the authentication methodology. He challenged the chain of custody of the digital materials. He brought up a technical objection about the packet routing analysis that was sophisticated enough to require a 10-minute pause, while Reyes and the court's forensic specialist, Dr. Torres, consulted on terminology. At the end of those 10 minutes, Doctor, Torres looked at Judge Wren and said quietly, "The methodology is sound, Your Honor. The objection doesn't change the conclusion." Fain sat down. In the gallery, someone exhaled audibly. Judge Wren did not look up from her notes. Deborah Rice walked to the stand with the specific composure of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had decided that the fear was not going to be the thing that defined what they did today. She was under formal court protection. A U.S. Marshal had accompanied her from a secure location that morning, and she had been brought through a side entrance, away from the cameras. She sat in the witness chair and looked at the courtroom with clear, steady eyes and folded her hands in her lap. Nia stood at the podium. "Ms. Rice," she said, "can you describe your role at Tilden Greer Associates?" "I was a senior paralegal. I worked primarily on complex commercial litigation. I was assigned to the Whitmore defense team when the case was filed 8 months ago." "In that capacity, did you have access to the document management system used by the firm?" "Yes, full administrative access. It was necessary for the document-intensive nature of the case." "Can you describe what you found in that system in the weeks before Marcus Tilden's disappearance?" Devora looked at her hands for just a moment. Not long, not the hesitation of reluctance, but the breath of someone who was about to say something they had been carrying for weeks and needed to set down carefully. "I found an access log showing that a user account had entered the firm's document architecture," she said. "Specifically, the folder structure above the Whitmore client folder. The account belonged to a former employee, someone who had left the firm in 2019 and whose credentials should have been deactivated." "What was the name associated with that account?" "Thomas Vale." The room didn't make a sound. "Did you report this to Marcus Tilden?" "Yes, immediately. The same day I found it." "And what was his response?" Devora was quiet for a moment. "He told me to stop working the document audit. He said he needed time to think. He told me not to discuss what I had found with anyone." She paused. "I thought he was being cautious. I followed his instruction, and then he disappeared, and I realized that what I had found wasn't something he was thinking carefully about. It was something he was afraid of." "When you say afraid of what?" "Of what it meant," Devora said. "If Thomas Vale was accessing the Whitmore document architecture from outside, using a credential that should have been dead while actively employed elsewhere, the question was who had reactivated that credential and why. And the answer to that question was going to be very inconvenient for someone." She looked at the room steadily. "I thought about leaving it alone. I thought about it for 3 weeks, sitting in my cousin's apartment, and then I decided that I couldn't." Nia let that sit for a moment in the room. Then she said, "Thank you, Ms. Rice. No further questions." Fain stood for cross-examination. He was measured. She could see him managing, from across the room, the constraints of a cross-examination that had limited room to maneuver without making things worse. He challenged Devorah's certainty about the account name. He suggested that access logs could be misread by someone without specialized technical training. He implied carefully that her departure from Tilden Greer under undisclosed circumstances might reflect an agenda. Devorah answered each question with the same steady composure. She didn't become defensive. She didn't elaborate beyond what she was asked. She simply restated what she had seen, in the same order and with the same words, because she had actually seen it. Fain ran out of angles in 14 minutes. He sat down. The emails were next. Daniel Marsh presented the email chain from the USB drive, the series of internal Aldrich Capital communications, verified by Paul Reyes's forensic analysis as unaltered, that traced the authorization chain from the litigation strategy memo to specific senior decision-makers. Marsh was good with the emails, in the way he was good with all formal presentation, methodical, building each layer on the foundation of the last, never getting ahead of his evidence. But it was the memo itself, finally entered into the full record with its provenance fully established, that changed the temperature of the room in the specific way that certain pieces of evidence changed rooms, not by being dramatic, but by being undeniable. Judge Wren read the budget appendix line, litigation leverage, and wrote something in her notes without looking up. The two words were there in the record now, in a document authenticated by court-recognized forensic analysis, in a font and format consistent with internal Aldrich Capital communications, in a file whose metadata was consistent with creation dates that predated the lawsuit. Fain objected to the memo's admissibility for the fourth time. Judge Wren denied it for the fourth time, with a brevity that suggested she was done discussing the question. He objected to the email chain. She denied that too. And then she said, "Mr. Fain, I'd like to hear from you regarding the overall evidentiary picture that has been presented this morning." Fain stood. He was, Nia thought, a genuinely good lawyer, and she could see in his face, in the quality of his stillness, the specific reckoning that genuinely good lawyers sometimes faced when they found themselves at the end of a road they hadn't known they were on. He had been given a case. He had been told it was straightforward. He had prepared it with the thoroughness of his profession and the confidence of his experience, and he had not asked, with sufficient rigor, the questions that someone with different information might have asked. "Your Honor," he said, "the plaintiff's position has been presented in good faith based on the evidence available at the time of filing. The defense has now presented materials that were not part of the original evidentiary record, and He stopped, restarted. "I am not in a position, at this moment, to contest the forensic validity of those materials." The gallery stirred. Someone near the back whispered something and was quickly silenced. "What I can tell the court," Fain continued, "is that if the materials submitted by the defense are accurate, and I am no longer in a position to argue that they are not, then the case as constructed was based on evidence that was itself manufactured. And I was not aware of that when I agreed to represent the plaintiff." Judge Wren looked at him for a moment. "Are you informing the court that the plaintiff's counsel was operating without full knowledge of the evidentiary basis for the claim?" "I am informing the court," Fain said carefully, "that I intend to review my firm's relationship with the plaintiff in light of today's proceedings." It was not a confession. It was not an exoneration. It was the specific, precisely calibrated language of a lawyer who was drawing a line, separating himself from something he had finally understood he had been standing inside of, in the only way that was simultaneously honest and self-protective. Judge Wren made a note. Then she looked at both parties over her reading glasses. "I'm going to take a 30-minute recess," she said. The 30 minutes felt like 3 hours. Nia sat at the defense table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her and her breathing even. Grant sat beside her. Daniel Marsh was on his phone at the far end of the table, speaking quietly. The gallery buzzed with the controlled energy of people who understood they were watching something significant and were trying to process it in real time. Grant said quietly, "You did everything you said you would do." "Not yet," she said. "Not until she rules. What do you think she'll do?" Nia looked at the empty bench, at the chair where Patricia Wren had sat for the past 2 weeks, examining and weighing and measuring, doing the work that judges did in the silence of their own judgment. I think she's a woman who became a federal judge because she believes the system is supposed to work, she said. And I think she's been watching it not work for 2 weeks, and she's ready for it to work. Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When this is over, regardless of how it ends today, I want to do something to acknowledge what you've done." "When this is over," she said, "you can help me do something I've been thinking about." He looked at her. What? She had been carrying the idea for days, not as a distraction, but as the thing that made sense of everything else. The reason the work mattered. The answer to the question of what you did with the truth once you had proven it. "There are people like me," she said. "People who know things and can't get anyone to listen because they don't have the credentials or the money or the connections to be taken seriously in rooms like this one. People who find the anomaly in the metadata and have no one to call. People who know the escape clause doesn't sound right and can't explain why to anyone who would help." She paused. "There should be somewhere they can go." Grant Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me what you need to build it." Judge Wren returned at exactly 30 minutes and called the court back to order with a single strike of her gavel. She took her seat. She opened the folder in front of her. She looked at the room with the steady, gravity-tested composure of 61 years and 16 years on the federal bench, and she began to speak. "This court has examined, over the course of these proceedings, evidence submitted by both the plaintiff and the defense in the matter of Aldrich Capital Partners versus Grant Whitmore. The plaintiff's case was constructed on forensic claims about the authenticity of a contractual provision, claims that were presented with apparent rigor and supported by expert testimony. The defense has now submitted materials that directly challenge the foundation of those claims, and those materials have been found, by this court's own forensic specialist, to be authentic and methodologically sound." She paused. The room was absolutely still. "The evidence demonstrates, with sufficient credibility to meet the relevant evidentiary standard, that the contractual provision at issue was not altered by the defendant. It was inserted into a duplicate version of the document through a technically sophisticated process involving VPN routed signature manipulation executed by a third party with documented connections to the plaintiff's organizational structure, as part of a deliberate strategy to manufacture grounds for litigation. That strategy is documented in the plaintiff's own internal communications, which include a budget line explicitly characterizing this lawsuit as, and I am quoting directly from the submitted exhibit, litigation leverage." She set the folder down. "On the basis of the evidence presented, this court finds that the plaintiff's claims are not supported by authentic evidence and are, in fact, contradicted by evidence indicating that the evidentiary basis for those claims was itself fraudulently constructed. The case against Grant Whitmore is dismissed in full." In the gallery, the stillness broke. Not in chaos. This was a federal courtroom, and the people in it were lawyers and journalists and professionals, but in the particular, irreversible release of a room where something had been decided. There was a sound, a collective exhale followed by the movement of people and the rustle of papers, and someone saying something in a low, urgent voice into a phone. Judge Wren waited for the room to settle, and it settled, because she was the kind of person rooms settled for. "Furthermore," she continued, and the room went quiet again, "the court is referring this matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District for investigation into potential criminal violations, including document fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to manipulate federal litigation. The court will make all evidentiary materials available to that office." She looked at the plaintiff's table, at the space where Fain sat, very still, with the expression of a man who was already somewhere else mentally, already calculating what came next. "The plaintiff's counsel is advised that the court expects full cooperation with any subsequent investigation." Fain nodded once. A small, precise nod. Judge Wren closed her folder. "We are adjourned." The gavel came down, and for 1 second after its sound, the room was perfectly quiet. The specific silence that followed the completion of something that had required a great deal of effort from everyone present to reach. Then Nia Carter exhaled. She didn't cry. She hadn't expected to cry, but she had wondered, in the abstract way that she sometimes thought about her own emotional architecture, whether the end of this would produce something like tears. It didn't. What it produced was a specific, deep stillness. The stillness of effort concluded, of a thing carried a long distance finally set down. She sat at the defense table with her hands in her lap and felt the room moving around her and was, for a full minute, simply present in it. Daniel Marsh shook her hand with both of his. He said something gracious and exactly right, in the way of a man who had been in this profession long enough to know what the right thing to say was, and she heard it and thanked him and meant it. Grant Whitmore did not shake her hand. He turned to her and looked at her for a long moment, the same quality of attention he had been looking at her with since the first day, that capacity for listening with his whole face. And then he said simply, "Thank you." She said, You're welcome." And then the reporters were there, from the gallery and from outside, cameras and microphones and the organized chaos of press converging on a story that had just formally become a story. She and Grant walked out of the courtroom together, which was not something they had planned but felt, in the moment, like the only thing to do. Not as a performance of alliance, but as the plain physical fact of two people who had been through something difficult together and were now on the other side of it. Outside on the courthouse steps, the cameras found them immediately. She stood in the clear October light, the navy blazer she had bought for a job interview she hadn't gotten, her legal pad tucked under her arm, and she looked at the reporters and the cameras and the people who had gathered on the steps with the same expression she had maintained throughout. Open, steady, not performing anything. "Ms. Carter," a reporter thrust a microphone toward her. "You walked into this courtroom as a hotel housekeeper and just dismantled a fraud conspiracy in a federal court. What do you want people to take from this?" She thought about the question. She thought about the first day, the laughter, the phones filming, the gallery full of people who had classified her before she said a word. She thought about the kitchen table at 2 a.m, the granola bar in the courthouse corridor, the phone call at 11:47, the photograph of Maya in the purple coat. She thought about Devorah Rice sitting in her cousin's apartment for 3 weeks, carrying what she knew. She thought about Harrison Blythe choosing the harder thing. She thought about her mother saying, "I know you." "I want people to understand that this case wasn't won because of who I am," she said. "It was won because the truth was there, in the documents, in the data, in the timeline. It was always there. It just needed someone to look for it carefully enough." She paused. There are people every day who have the truth on their side and can't make the system hear it, because they don't have the right credentials, or the right connections, or the right amount of money. That's not a problem that goes away with one case, but it's a problem that can be worked on. Another reporter. "Mr. Whitmore, you placed your defense in the hands of a hotel housekeeper. Why?" Grant looked at the reporter with the measured calm of a man who had spent 2 weeks watching someone prove that his most sophisticated instincts were correct. "I place my defense in the hands of the most prepared person in the room," he said. "It happens that she also works at the Meridian Grand. Both things are true." Carla Osei was at the edge of the press cluster, not with a microphone, just watching, with the expression of someone whose professional satisfaction was real but unhurried. She caught Nia's eye and gave one small, precise nod. Nia nodded back. Bam. In the weeks that followed, the story moved through the world in the way that certain stories moved, with momentum that couldn't be managed or redirected, only absorbed. The U.S. Attorney's Office opened a formal investigation into Aldrich Capital Partners. 3 senior executives were named in the initial filing. Thomas Vail was located in Montreal and detained for questioning. The investigation into the unauthorized credential access was taken up by the FBI's Cyber Division, and within 6 weeks, Vail had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced charge framework that his attorneys spent considerable time negotiating. Marcus Tilden surfaced in the 4th week, not dramatically, not with cameras. He walked into a federal field office in Washington, D.C., with an attorney and a prepared statement, and began answering questions about what he had found, what he had been told, and what he had done with the information before he disappeared. The specific details of his account were not public for several months, but when they became public, they confirmed what Nia had suspected from the beginning. He had found the Vail access log through Devorah's initial flag, had taken it to a senior partner at his firm, and had been told, in language that was not subtle, that the information was inconvenient and should be managed quietly. He had spent the following weeks trying to understand what that meant, before choosing, finally, to disappear rather than comply or confront. It was not the heroic choice, it was the human one, made by a man who was more complicated than his absence suggested. And Nia, when she read his account, held it in the same way she held most human things, with recognition, without judgment, and with a clear-eyed understanding of what it cost people to do the right thing when the right thing was also the frightening one. Douglas Fane withdrew from the representation of Aldrich Capital 4 days after the dismissal. The statement his firm released was brief and professionally worded. He did not, in the months that followed, become a villain in the public account of the story, partly because the evidence didn't support that characterization, and partly because Nia, when Carla asked her about him directly in the long Tribune profile that ran 6 weeks after the hearing, said only that he was a skilled attorney who had been given incomplete information and had handled its completion with more integrity than many people in his position would have. Carla printed that quote verbatim, because it was true, and because it was the kind of quote that revealed something important about the person saying it. Harrison Blythe spent 3 months without employment in a profession that tended to remember the names of people who made difficult disclosures. Then he was hired by a civil rights legal organization in Brooklyn at a salary that was approximately 40% of what he had been making, and he showed up on his first day with the slightly disoriented expression of someone who had given up something significant and had not yet fully taken the measure of what he had gained. The People's Law Project opened its doors on a Tuesday in January, in a rented second-floor space on 125th Street in Harlem, with 6 desks, 2 filing cabinets, 3 volunteers, and a case backlog that Nia had built over the preceding 8 weeks by simply making it known, through Carla's reporting, through community organizations she had contacted, through word of mouth in neighborhoods where word of mouth was the primary infrastructure, that there was a place where people who had been told their case was too complicated or their voice was too small could come and be taken seriously. The funding came from Grant Whitmore through a structured grant arrangement that Nia had spent 3 weeks negotiating to ensure the organization's independence. An arrangement that gave the project full operational autonomy and required Grants Foundation to renew support annually based on the organization's own reporting rather than his approval of its casework. It was, she had told him, the only kind of funding she would accept. "You negotiated harder for your own independence than for anything in that courtroom," he had said, reading the draft agreement. "In that courtroom I was working for someone else," she said. "This is mine." He had signed it without further comment. On the opening Tuesday, 31 people came through the door. Some of them had cases. Some of them were curious. Some of them were workers who had been told their complaints didn't have merit, or tenants who had been told their leases were clear when they weren't, or people who had found anomalies in documents and had no one to call. Nia and her 3 volunteers listened to each of them with complete attention, took notes, asked questions, and made promises only about what they could actually deliver. At the end of the day, Nia sat at her desk in the empty office after everyone else had gone, with a cup of coffee and the case intake forms from the day's 31 appointments spread across the surface in front of her, and she felt the same stillness she had felt on the courthouse steps. The specific quality of a thing completed, a thing begun. Maya called at 7:30. "How was the first day, Mama?" "Busy," Nia said. "Good busy." "Did you help people?" "Started to," she said. "That's what first days are." "Are you coming home?" "In 20 minutes," she said. "Have you eaten?" "Grandma made soup." "Save me some." She hung up and sat for another moment, looking at the 31 case files. 31 people who had come through a door they hadn't known existed 6 months ago. 31 people who had decided, for whatever specific reason, that today was the day to say the thing they knew and see if someone would listen. She thought about what it meant, not in the abstract, not in the vocabulary of justice as a concept, but in the plain, specific human reality of it. What it meant to walk into a room and be taken seriously. What it meant to find that the thing you had noticed, the anomaly, the inconsistency, the thing that didn't add up, mattered to someone who had the tools to do something with it. She thought about a 22-year-old in the front row of a contracts class, paying tuition by cleaning offices at night, believing in something that circumstances would later require her to set aside temporarily but never actually abandon. She thought about the years between that classroom and this desk, the hotel corridors, the early shifts, Maya growing from an infant to a girl who read mystery novels and thought her mother knew how to fix anything. She thought about the apron she had been wearing on the first day. She thought about the laughter. She thought about what she had done with both. Outside the window, 125th Street was fully alive in the way that Harlem was always alive. Full, complicated, specific, belonging to itself. The sounds of it came through the glass in the way that city sounds did. Layered and continuous. The ongoing conversation of a place that had always known how to survive in rooms that weren't built for it by building its own. She finished her coffee. She stacked the 31 case files in a neat pile. She turned off her desk lamp. Then she put on her coat, picked up her bag, and walked down the stairs and out into the street and into the evening, which was cold and clear, and hers. 1 year later, she was standing in front of a room. 38 people. Sanitation workers, home health aides, warehouse supervisors. A woman who drove a school bus and had found what she believed was systematic wage theft in her employer's payroll records. A man who worked building maintenance and had documented safety violations that he couldn't get anyone to investigate. They were sitting in folding chairs in the project's expanded space, a full floor now, on 125th, with 8 staff and a growing network of pro bono attorneys who had heard about the work and wanted to be part of it. Nia stood at the front of the room and looked at them, at the specific, ordinary, extraordinary faces of people who had decided that knowing the truth was not enough and being afraid was not enough, and that something else was required. People who had come to this room because they believed that the truth, in the right hands, with the right tools, could be made to matter. She thought about what to say. She had prepared remarks, careful ones, but she set them aside. "I want to tell you something that I learned the hard way," she said. "The system isn't built to hear you. That's not a guess. That's a design feature. It is very specifically, very intentionally built to make the cost of speaking too high for most people to pay." She looked around the room. "But the system has a weakness, and the weakness is that the truth is patient. It waits in documents and in data and in the memories of people who saw what they saw, and it waits for someone who is willing to do the work of assembling it carefully enough that the room has no choice but to hear it." She paused. "That person can be you. That's what we're here to prove." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the woman who drove the school bus raised her hand and said, "Where do we start?" Nia looked at her. She smiled. Not the performed smile. Not the smile she kept in reserve for rooms that required management. The real one. "With what you know," she said. "Always with what you know." And the work continued.